She was the nurse nobody took seriously, shaking hands, downcast eyes, the kind of woman doctors talked over without a second thought. Every shift at Vantage Memorial Hospital, Dr. Callum Rourke found a new reason to remind her she didn't belong. Tonight, he did it in front of the entire emergency department, loud enough that even the janitor at the far end of the hall stopped mopping to look. Claire Ashton stood there and took it. She always did. What nobody in that hospital understood was that the trembling in her hands had nothing to do with weakness. And in about 40 minutes, every single one of them would find that out the hard way. Before we go any further, if you're new here, hit that subscribe button right now because this is exactly the kind of story you do not want to walk into halfway through. Drop a like if you're already hooked, and tell me in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your city, your country, anything. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning of the night that changed everything. The fluorescent lights in the emergency department at Vantage Memorial Hospital had been flickering since 7 p.m., and nobody had bothered to call maintenance. That was the kind of place it was. A mid-tier regional hospital in Garfield Falls, Montana, perpetually understaffed, perpetually underfunded, running on burnt coffee and institutional stubbornness. The waiting room was half full by 9. By 10:30, it was standing room only. Claire Ashton arrived for her night shift 12 minutes early, the same as every shift. She signed in at the nursing station, tied her dark hair back with the same worn elastic she'd been using for 3 weeks, and checked the board without being asked. Pediatric fever in Bay 2, chest pain in 4, possible fracture in 6. She pulled the charts in order and started moving. She was 34 years old and had been at Vantage Memorial for 2 years. In that time, she had made exactly 0 enemies among the support staff, had never been written up, had never called in sick, and had never once been the subject of a patient complaint. She had also never been promoted, never been consulted on anything beyond her assigned duties, and had been passed over twice for a charge nurse position that went first to a woman with 6 months of experience and connections to the hospital board, and then to a man who openly admitted he hadn't reviewed a medication protocol since his licensing exam. None of that was an accident. Claire made sure of it. She had a way of shrinking herself that took deliberate effort. The slightly rounded posture. The voice kept a register lower than it needed to be, soft enough that people asked her to repeat herself. The hesitation before speaking that read as uncertainty but was actually calculation. She had spent 2 years perfecting the art of being forgettable, and she was very, very good at it. The only thing she hadn't been able to control were her hands. They trembled. Not violently, not constantly, but enough. A fine, persistent tremor that surfaced under fluorescent light and showed up worst when she was tired. 2 different attending physicians had noticed it and mentioned it to the nursing director. The nursing director had mentioned it to Claire in a tone that suggested she was doing her a favor by letting her stay. Claire had thanked her and said nothing else. The tremor had a history she didn't share with anyone at Vantage Memorial. Most things about her did. She was finishing a dressing change in Bay 6 when she heard Dr. Callum Rourke's voice carrying down the hall. Rourke was the senior trauma attending on tonight, 41 years old, 7 years at this hospital, and constitutionally incapable of lowering his volume. He was good at his job. Claire had watched him work enough shifts to know that much was true. He was also the specific kind of man who needed an audience for everything he did, including being right, and especially including being displeased. She heard her name. She finished securing the gauze, told the patient she'd be back to check in 20 minutes, and stepped out into the corridor. Rourke was standing at the nursing station with 2 residents and a charge nurse named Patty Osgood, who had the particular expression of someone who wanted to be anywhere else. He was holding a medication chart and pointing at it the way someone might point at evidence of a crime. "Where is Ashton?" he said, not looking up. Then he looked up and saw her. "There you are. Come here." She walked over. She kept her expression neutral. "Can you explain this?" He turned the chart toward her. "You flagged a contraindication on the Delacroix admission, metoprolol interaction." "Yes," she said. "The patient is on a compounded thyroid medication from a pharmacy in Billings. The formulation has a higher active ingredient concentration than standard. Combined with the dose of metoprolol written on the order, the interaction risk was—" "The interaction risk," Rourke said, cutting her off, "was flagged by the system. which I saw, which I evaluated, which I determined was not clinically significant in this context. The system flagged a generic interaction. It didn't flag the specific formulation. I looked it up. You looked it up? Yes. He stared at her for a moment. Then he glanced at the residents with a small, practiced smile, the kind of smile that invited other people to find something funny. She looked it up, he said, in the middle of a shift, while patients are waiting. It took 4 minutes, Claire said. That's not the point. He set the chart down. The point is that you flagged an order written by an attending physician without consulting me, based on research you conducted independently during your shift, which means you were not doing your actual job for those 4 minutes. She looked at him steadily. The patient has a documented cardiac history, a significant hypotensive event. Would have been managed, he said, by the physicians. That is our job. Your job is to administer medications as ordered and notify the team of patient status changes. It is not to audit prescriptions. Patty Osgood was looking at the floor. The 2 residents had found something very interesting to study on their tablet screens. I understand, Claire said. I'm not sure you do. Rourke crossed his arms. This is the 3rd time this month you've either delayed a medication administration or flagged something above your scope. The first time I let it go. The second time I mentioned it. This time I'm going to say it plainly. If you are not confident in your ability to execute standard nursing duties without second-guessing the medical team, that is a problem. It's a problem for patient flow. It's a problem for team cohesion. And frankly, he paused, and his voice dropped just slightly, not in consideration, but in the particular register of a man about to say something he's thought about for a while. It might suggest that this environment isn't the right fit. The corridor was quiet. A monitor beeped somewhere down the hall. Maybe emergency nursing just isn't where you belong, he said. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She stood there in the flickering fluorescent light with her hands at her sides and met his eyes without any particular expression at all. And something about that, the absence of hurt, the absence of apology, the simple flat steadiness of her gaze, made him look away first. I'll keep that in mind, she said. She turned and went back to work. The next hour was ordinary in the way that ER nights can be ordinary, which meant controlled chaos, predictable mayhem, the kind of busy that keeps your hands moving and your mind from wandering anywhere it shouldn't. Claire worked through it the way she always did, efficiently, quietly. She checked on her patients in sequence, administered medications, updated charts, fielded the specific and occasionally panicked questions of a first-year resident named Dr. Tobias Park, who was having a rough night and kept appearing at her elbow with the expression of someone drowning in slow motion. The guy in Bay 8 is asking for more pain medication and he's already at the top of his dosing window, Park said, catching her in the supply corridor. When did he last receive? Hour 40 ago. He's got 20 minutes. Tell him that. Tell him you hear him and offer him the repositioning and ice pack in the meantime. Document that you assessed the request. Park stared at her. Yeah, okay. That's what I should say? That's what I'd say. Right. He hesitated. Rourke said, I know what Dr. Rourke said. She handed him a supply she'd pulled without being asked, something he would need in the next 5 minutes and hadn't realized yet. Go check on your patient. He looked down at the supply, looked up at her, opened his mouth, closed it again, and went. She turned back to the corridor and almost walked into Patty Osgood coming the other direction. Hey, Patty said, and her voice was low. That was rough earlier with Rourke. It's fine. It wasn't fine. That interaction flag was correct. I looked it up after. Patty glanced down the hall. You were right about the formulation. I know, Claire said simply. Patty blinked. She'd been expecting something else. Deflection or gratitude. Or the standard performance of someone reassuring a colleague that there were no hard feelings. What she got was just the flat acknowledgement of a fact. Okay, she said after a moment. Just wanted you to know. Thank you, Patty. She moved on. So, the call came in at 11:52. Claire was at the nursing station when the radio crackled with the ambulance dispatch, and she was close enough to hear the paramedic's voice clearly. Single male patient, mid-30s, multiple gunshot wounds to the torso and left arm, combative, had already fought off 2 paramedics and was physically restrained and not fully sedated because the first sedation attempt had produced a paradoxical agitation response. Rourke was already pulling on gloves. He pointed at 2 of his residents. "Trauma Bay 1. Let's go." He glanced at the board. "Ashton, I need you on fluids and monitoring, Bay 1. Try not to second-guess anyone." She was already moving. The ambulance bay doors opened at 11:58. The paramedics came through fast, and the moment the gurney cleared the threshold, everyone in the trauma bay understood this was different from what they'd been told to expect. The man on the gurney was not simply combative. He was in a full physiological threat response, heart rate that the monitor immediately screamed at, a blood pressure reading that was simultaneously shocking and keeping him conscious, and an expression of pure tactical threat assessment that swept the room the moment he entered it. He was large, not in the exaggerated way of someone who spent time performing size, but in the dense, load-bearing way of someone whose body had been treated as a tool for a long time. His arms were partially restrained, and he had already worked one wrist partially free. There was blood on his shirt, on his face, on the restraint on his left arm, and he was tracking every person in the room with the kind of attention that made the first-year resident take an involuntary step backward. Okay. One of the paramedics, a big man who looked like he'd seen everything, was leaning hard on the gurney rail and breathing fast. He came around about 3 minutes out. We could not keep him down. "Get me an IV access, 2 large bore," Rourke said. "Push the midazolam, we need to..." The patient's free hand came up and caught the wrist of the nearest resident. Not violently, not with rage. Precisely. Targeted. The resident made a high, frightened sound and jerked back, and the patient tracked the movement and started to sit up against the restraints with a kind of focused, methodical effort that suggested the restraints were not going to hold for long. "Get security in here now!" Rourke's voice had gone to its command register. "Don't approach him. Do not approach. I need more midazolam." He had a paradoxical to the first dose. A second dose could... Then ketamine. Not with that blood pressure. The room was fracturing. Everyone was moving at the edges, backing up, talking over each other. And the patient in the center of it was sitting up straighter, the monitor leads pulling taut, his eyes moving through the space with a systematic efficiency that was deeply, specifically frightening because it was not rage. He was not panicking. He was assessing. He was making decisions. He said something. Quiet. In a language Claire recognized immediately from 12 feet away. She had been standing at the fluid station, and she went still. Then she handed the IV bag to Patty Osgood, who was nearest to her, and said quietly, "Hold this." "Ashton," Rourke's voice was sharp, "do not approach that patient." She was already walking forward. "Ashton?" "Doctor." Her voice was different. Not loud, not hard, but carrying in a way her voice never carried in this hospital. "Please step back." The room did not go quiet because she asked. It went quiet because of the way she walked, not toward a threat, not away from one, but through the space as if the threat and the chaos and the beeping monitors and the raised voices were all elements she had already accounted for and set aside. She moved like someone who had done something very similar to this in a place that was much, much worse, and everyone in the room, even Rourke, felt that without being able to explain it. She stopped at the side of the gurney. The patient was tracking her now. His eyes were on her face. His breathing was hard, his jaw tight, the tendons in his restrained arms standing out against the strap, but he had not moved in the last 6 seconds. She held his gaze. She reached up slowly and rested her hand on the side rail of the gurney, not touching him, just present. And then she spoke 2 words. Under her breath, just audible to the patient, in a cadence and a specific form that had nothing to do with any civilian medical protocol in any hospital in the country. A call sign. Classified. The kind of alphanumeric designation that belonged to a specific operational unit, spoken in the specific pronunciation of someone who had used it operationally. The effect was instantaneous. The man went still. Not sedated still. Not compliant still. The particular stillness of someone who had been given information, a signal, a context, a verification, that reoriented everything. His eyes changed. The tactical assessment in them did not disappear, but it shifted. He looked at her differently than he had looked at anyone else in the room. His restrained wrist relaxed. His free hand came down slowly and rested flat on the gurney. Nobody in the trauma bay spoke. The monitor continued its alarmed beeping. Somewhere down the hall, another patient called for a nurse. The fluorescent light above the trauma bay flickered once and held. Rourke was staring at her from across the gurney. His gloves were still on. His mouth was partially open. The paramedic at the door said, very quietly, "How did she do that?" Claire leaned in slightly, her voice still low, and said something else to the patient. He turned his head just enough to look at her directly, and she held that look. And after a moment, he gave a single small nod. "I need a surgical consult for the chest wound," she said, and her voice was back to its normal register, even, unremarkable. "The left arm has a through and through that can wait. Get me the ultrasound for the chest." Nobody moved for 1 full second. "Now please," she said, with exactly the same inflection she used when she was asking for someone to restock the supply cabinet. The room came back to life. Rourke moved to the other side of the gurney. He was watching her. She wasn't watching him back. She was watching her patient, one hand now resting on the man's forearm, monitoring the pulse at his wrist the way she'd been trained to do in an environment where attaching monitors wasn't always an option. "Ashton." Rourke's voice was controlled. Careful now, in a way it hadn't been an hour ago in the corridor. "What was that?" "He's a combat veteran," she said. "High stress response. Familiar communication approach helped de-escalate." She looked up briefly. "That ultrasound, please." "That's not—" He stopped. Started again. "What you said to him? What language—" "Dr. Rourke." She looked at him fully. "He has a pneumothorax developing. If you want to discuss communication techniques, I'm available after we stabilize him." Something moved across Rourke's face that she hadn't seen there before. Not anger. Something less comfortable. Something that people feel when a category they've assigned a person to stops fitting and they don't yet have another one to replace it with. He turned and called for the ultrasound himself. The next 17 minutes were the most concentrated and technically demanding work Claire had done inside a hospital in 2 years. The patient, whose name she didn't say out loud, though she knew it, had known it the moment she saw his face, was deteriorating on a specific timeline she recognized from pattern, and she moved through interventions with a precision that had a different texture than standard ER nursing. Park noticed it first. He was assisting on the chest, and he kept glancing at her hands, at the way she was working, at the specific order in which she made decisions, and his expression cycled through confusion and then something closer to recognition of his own ignorance, the dawning awareness that he was watching something he didn't have a framework for. Her hands weren't shaking. That was the thing Rourke couldn't stop looking at. He'd seen her hands shake every shift for 2 years, under the fluorescent lights, under pressure, whenever she was tired. Everyone on staff had noticed it. It was one of the things people mentioned when they mentioned Claire Ashton, one of the quiet reasons she was considered a competent but limited practitioner, someone doing their best within their constraints. Her hands were not shaking now. They were completely, absolutely steady, moving with a fluid confidence that had no hesitation in it, no second-guessing, no performance of certainty. Just the real thing. She caught him looking. She said nothing. She went back to work. The chest stabilized. The patient's vitals began their slow negotiation toward the less alarming end of the spectrum. He was sedated now, properly, with a protocol she had recommended and Rourke had approved without his usual editorial, and he was breathing easier, and the immediate crisis was past. Claire stepped back from the gurney and stripped off her gloves. Rourke was 2 feet away. He had his arms crossed, which was his default posture for uncertainty, and he was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. "I want an explanation," he said. "I know you do." "That's not a deflection, Ashton. That's a direct request from the attending physician." "I understand." She turned to pull a fresh pair of gloves from the box on the wall. "And I'll answer your questions. But right now, I need to go check on the patient in bay." The radio at the nursing station went off. Then a second radio. Then someone's phone. The sound spread down the corridor in a wave, the way bad news moves through a building. She heard the words clearly. Multiple casualties, incoming, estimated 7 to 9 patients, trauma, and critical, military affiliation, requesting emergency department lockdown protocol. She heard something else too, just beneath it, in the static and the garbled transmission, a name they were asking for. Not her name. Not the name on her badge or her personnel file. A different name. Her real one. Rourke was watching her face when she heard it. He saw something happen in her expression. Not fear, not surprise, but a specific settled kind of recognition. The look of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen, and now that it has, is simply confirming that their estimate of the timeline was accurate. "Ashton," he said slowly, "what is going on?" She was already moving toward the trauma bay door. "Lock down the ambulance entrance," she said over her shoulder. "Triage in the secondary bay. I need 2 nurses pulled from the floor and I need them now." She paused at the door and turned. "And Dr. Rourke, whatever you thought you knew about tonight, set it aside. We're somewhere else now." She walked out into the corridor, and in the distant wail of incoming sirens and the flat white light of the emergency department, the woman who had spent 2 years being the nurse, nobody noticed moved through the space like she owned every square foot of it. The sirens were already close when Claire reached the secondary triage bay, and she used every second of the 30-second gap between her arrival and the first ambulance to reorganize the room in her head. Not the physical room, that was fine, adequate, she'd worked worse, but the people in it. She needed to know who would hold and who would fold, and she needed to know it fast because what was coming through that ambulance bay door was not going to leave room for on-the-job assessment. Patty Osgood was right behind her. Good. Patty was a 12-year ER nurse who kept her hands steady even when her voice cracked, and her voice almost never cracked. Park was hovering at the edge of the corridor looking like he'd had too much coffee and not enough training, which was accurate, but he was also the only resident available who had shown any capacity for taking direction without arguing about it first. She'd use him on monitoring and documentation, keep him away from anything that required lateral thinking under pressure. The other nurse who'd been pulled from the floor was a young man named Devlin who had been at Vantage Memorial for 7 months, and whose competence Claire had quietly clocked on a Tuesday 3 weeks ago when he'd caught a potassium level discrepancy that 2 residents had missed. He didn't know she'd noticed. That was fine. "Devlin," she said. He looked up, surprised she knew his name. "IV access and fluid prep. I want 6 large-bore setups ready before the first patient comes through. Patty, airway cart. Make sure the video laryngoscope is charged. Dr. Park," she turned to him. "You're documenting vitals and times on every patient the moment they hit the bay. Don't interpret, don't intervene, don't make calls. Write down what you see and tell me the moment anything changes." "Shouldn't Dr. Rourke be—" "Dr. Rourke is managing the first patient and will be here when he can." She looked at Park directly. "Can you do what I just described?" He straightened slightly. "Yes." "Good." She turned back to the ambulance bay entrance and felt, more than heard, the change in the air outside, the specific compression of multiple vehicles arriving in sequence, the radio chatter that had been cycling on the desk unit going suddenly quiet in the way that meant the situation on the ground had evolved past the point where updates were the priority. The first gurney came through at 12:19. The man on it was in his late 30s, wearing civilian clothes that didn't fit the way civilian clothes fit people who spent their days in them. He had a wound on his right thigh that had been field dressed with something that was not standard emergency medical equipment. The wrapping technique was specific, compressed in a way that prioritized function over anything else. And he was conscious, tracking the room, and the first thing he did when the gurney cleared the threshold was make eye contact with Claire. He didn't say anything, neither did she, but something passed between them that was not a greeting and not a question, and Patty Osgood, watching from the airway cart, felt the hair on her arms stand up without being able to explain why. The second gurney followed 40 seconds later. Chest wound. This one was not conscious. The paramedic doing compressions, one-handed, leaning hard, her face the specific white of someone burning through adrenaline faster than it could be replaced, looked up at Claire and said, "He was talking 5 minutes ago." "How long down?" "Maybe 90 seconds. We got a pulse back, lost it again 2 minutes out." "Rate before?" 40 and dropping. Claire was already moving. She didn't frame it as a decision. Her hands went to the man's chest, and she was reading the compression rhythm and the paramedic's fatigue and the monitor readout in parallel. And she said to Park, without looking up, "Time of secondary arrest, 12:20. Document it." "Got it." The third gurney came in before the second patient was fully transferred to the bay table, and then the fourth, and the ER took on the particular character of a room that is working at the edge of its capacity. Not chaos, not yet, but the sensation of a structure being tested at every load-bearing point simultaneously. Rourke arrived at 12:23. He took one look at the secondary bay, and then at Claire, and then at the patients being processed in a triage order that he had not set and did not immediately recognize, and she could see him working through whether to assert himself and deciding, for once, to assess first. "Talk to me," he said, coming to stand beside her. "4 inbound, 2 already here. First patient, through and through GSW, right thigh, field-dressed, stable, for now, needs imaging for vascular. Second patient, cardiac arrest and transport, possible tension pneumo based on presentation. I need a needle in his chest in the next 4 minutes. Third and fourth are still outside." What is this? He wasn't asking about the medical situation. He was asking about something larger, and she knew it. "It's a mass casualty presentation with a military affiliation," she said, "which is what dispatch told us." "That's not—" He stopped, picked up the nearest chart, looked at it, put it down. "The first patient, the one in Trauma Bay 1. He's connected to this?" "Yes." "How do you know that?" She looked at him. "Needle decompression, Dr. Rourke. Now or in 2 minutes. Your call." He held her gaze for 1 second, and then he pulled gloves and moved to the second patient, and she moved with him, and the conversation was over for the next 7 minutes while they worked. The tension pneumo was confirmed and addressed. The cardiac rhythm came back ugly, and then steadied into something they could work with, and by the time the third and fourth patients were inside and assigned, the secondary bay had the frantic, pressurized efficiency of a system doing more than it was designed to do and not quite breaking under it. Not yet. It was during the lull, relative maybe 4 minutes where no new patients arrived and the existing 4 were temporarily stable, that Rourke pulled Claire into the corridor. He didn't touch her. He positioned himself in her path in a way that made stopping the only practical option. "I need you to explain something," he said. His voice was quiet in the way that meant he was working hard to keep it that way. "And I need you to do it right now, because I have a department full of patients I don't fully understand, 3 of whom have injuries that are not consistent with any civilian scenario I can construct, and a first patient in Trauma Bay 1 who has been asking, in English, for someone named Valkyrie." He paused. "Are you going to tell me that's a coincidence?" She looked at him. The corridor was briefly empty around them, the noise of the department a few feet away, but held at a remove by the specific bubble of this moment. "No," she said. "So you know what Valkyrie means?" "Yes." "Is it you?" She didn't answer immediately, not because she was deciding whether to answer. She was deciding how much of the answer to give, and which version of it was the one that would be most useful in the next 2 hours, in this specific location, to this specific man. "I used to be," she said. He stared at her. He opened his mouth. "Dr. Rourke." Her voice was not unkind. "I understand that you have questions. I have every intention of answering them at the appropriate time to the appropriate people. Right now, you're going to tell me to go back to work. I'm going to tell you that the people in those bays need both of us, and that whatever I was before I came to this hospital is not currently relevant to whether the man in Bay 4 keeps his cardiac rhythm. That is currently relevant." Something crossed his face. Not agreement, not acceptance, but the reluctant recognition of a practical truth. He was a physician before he was anything else. Whatever else he was feeling, he could not override that. He turned and went back into the bay. She followed. It was Patty who first said it out loud. She said it to Devlin, under her breath, while she was resupplying the crash cart and he was running a new IV line. Sometime around 12:40. She said it quietly, not intending it to travel, but the secondary bay had a specific acoustic quality when the ambient noise dropped, and it traveled to where Claire was standing at the monitor station 6 feet away. She's not just a nurse. Devlin didn't answer. He didn't have to. Claire kept her eyes on the monitor. She adjusted the alarm threshold on the second patient's cardiac line and documented it and said nothing, because there was nothing to say. She had known this moment was coming from the second the first gurney came through the door, probably earlier, probably from the second she'd heard the call sign on the radio, and understood that tonight was not going to be another ordinary shift that she navigated by staying small. The thing about staying small for 2 years was that it required a specific and exhausting kind of attention. You couldn't do it on instinct. Every instinct she had ran the opposite direction, toward the front, toward the problem, toward whatever needed doing. She had spent 2 years learning to override that, to pause a half second too long before speaking, to ask questions she already knew the answers to let things get slightly worse before she intervened so that her intervention didn't read as automatic or disproportionate. She had done it because she needed the cover. She had done it because the alternative was a different kind of exposure, and 2 years ago, exposure had been the thing most likely to get her killed. But tonight the cover was gone, and she could feel the shape of who she actually was pressing up against the surface of who she'd been pretending to be, and it was like the difference between wearing a coat one size too small and finally being allowed to take it off. Her hands were still not shaking. At 12:51, the hospital administrator arrived in the ER. His name was Gerald Holt, and he was a man whose primary qualification for his role was an ability to project administrative calm at moments when his actual emotional state was something closer to managed panic. He came in through the staff entrance with his lanyard swinging and his phone in his hand, looked at the secondary triage bay, looked at the board, and found Rourke. "What is the situation?" 7 patients, mass casualty presentation, military affiliation, 4 critical, 3 stable. Military affiliation meaning what exactly? Do we have an incident on record? Is this combat related? Is there a... "I don't have all the information," Rourke said flatly, which was approximately the first honest thing he'd said about his own state of knowledge in the last 40 minutes. And Claire, who overheard it from the bay, noted it. "I'm being told there are federal personnel on the way," Holt said, dropping his voice. "Someone from dispatch mentioned military units. Are we looking at some kind of..." "Gerald!" Rourke cut him off, not rudely, but with the efficiency of someone who does not have a spare second for speculative conversation. "When those personnel arrive, they can come to me. Right now, I need you to get me 2 more nurses from the floor, open a 3rd trauma bay, and make sure security knows the ambulance entrance is restricted." Holt looked like he wanted to ask at least 4 more questions. He chose not to. He left. Rourke came back into the bay and stopped 2 feet from Claire and said quietly, "Federal personnel." "I heard." "You don't seem surprised." "I'm not." He looked at her for a long moment. She was adjusting a fluid rate, not looking at him, and he watched her hands, steady, precise, moving with an unconscious fluency that he recognized now as something trained into the body over a long time and under conditions he could not directly imagine. "You have to know how this looks from where I'm standing," he said, and his voice had lost the edge it usually carried. Not softened exactly, just different, like a man who has realized he's been reading a map upside down. "I know exactly how it looks," she said, "and I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to trust what you can see. What I can see is a nurse who apparently speaks classified military call signs and knew 7 mass casualty patients were coming before they arrived. And what else?" He was quiet for a moment. "And that everyone in those bays is still alive." He said it like it cost him something. She looked at him then. "That's enough for now," she said. "Quatim." The first of the military personnel arrived at 1:07 in the morning. There were 4 of them, and they came through the main ER entrance in civilian clothes that fooled nobody who was paying any real attention. The way they moved through the space, scanning in a pattern that was not curious but systematic, maintaining specific distances from each other, one of them positioning himself near the exit within 6 seconds of entering, was not the movement pattern of people arriving at a hospital out of concern. These were people arriving at a location and securing it. The one in front was a woman, late 40s, short dark hair cut practically, and she moved to the nursing station and produced identification that she held low and brief in the way of someone who was not trying to be seen by the room. She asked for the charge nurse. Patty Osgood, who had charged tonight, came over, looked at the ID, and went looking for Claire with the expression of someone who has just been handed a problem they are relieved to pass along. Claire was in the corridor when Patty found her. "There's someone at the station asking for—" Patty stopped. "She said to ask for Valkyrie. She said she'd know what that meant." "I know," Claire said. "Does it mean you?" Claire looked at her. Patty had been at this hospital longer than anyone else on staff tonight. She had 12 years of ER nursing, and she had watched Claire come in through the door 2 years ago and be assigned to the weakest rotation and work her way through it without complaint and without flourish. And she had been the only person on staff who brought Claire coffee on her first shift without being asked, and who noticed when Claire was having a particularly bad night and quietly took on extra tasks without making it a conversation. "Yes," Claire said. "It means me." Patty absorbed this. She nodded once, slowly, the way people nod when they've just had something confirmed that they already knew, somewhere underneath the level of articulate thought. "Okay," she said, "she's at the station." The woman's name was Agent Daria Thorne, and she was NCIS, and she established that in approximately 14 words before moving on to the thing she'd actually come to say, which was delivered in a voice low enough that it didn't carry past the two of them. "We have a situation," Thorne said. "I can see that. The operators you're treating tonight, they're part of a unit that was declared non-operational 18 months ago, officially. Their last mission on record terminated in a declared failure with confirmed casualties." She paused. "You understand what I mean by that?" "Yes." Claire's voice was even. "The people who declared that failure, who wrote those reports, who certified the casualty lists, they know these men are alive tonight. We believe the attack that generated your patients this evening was not random. It was a targeted elimination effort to ensure that a specific set of people did not reach a location where they could provide testimony. You're telling me they're still a target?" "I'm telling you that the men in those bays may still be a target, yes. We're working to establish a perimeter, but this hospital is a civilian facility and our options are limited," Claire said. "I understand." Thorne looked at her directly for the first time, a straight-line assessment that lasted about 3 seconds and covered a lot of ground. "Your name on the casualty list from that operation," she said carefully. "We've known for some time that it was incorrect." "Have you?" "We've been trying to locate you for 14 months. "I know that too." Something shifted in Thorne's expression. Not surprise, something more like the specific kind of relief that investigative people feel when a piece they've been working around slots into place. "The operators in your bays, you know them." "Some of them," Claire said. "Not all." "The first one, Trauma Bay 1. His name is—" "I know his name," Claire said quietly. Thorne paused. Then, "He asked for you specifically. That's how we track this hospital." "I assume that." "He said—" She stopped, looked down briefly, which was the first crack in her composure. "He said if anyone could keep them alive until we got here, it was you." The corridor was quiet for a moment. A monitor alarm sounded briefly in the bay behind them and was silenced. "Then let's make sure he was right," Claire said. "Chet." She went back into the secondary bay, and the next 40 minutes were the hardest work she'd done inside a building in 2 years. Not because the cases were beyond her, but because she was doing it in a hospital, with hospital equipment, and hospital equipment was not the same as field equipment, and her hands knew the difference even if her mind was the same. There were moments when her muscle memory reached for instruments she didn't have and found substitutes and made the adjustment, and there were moments when the substitutes were adequate and moments when they weren't, and she worked around the gaps with a focused improvisation that had Devlin watching her with open concentration, like a student watching someone demonstrate a technique that wasn't in any textbook he'd read. Rourke was working beside her. He had stopped asking her questions. He was following her lead in a way that had no formal announcement, no acknowledgement, just the practical and slightly startling shift of a senior physician orienting himself to someone else's operational gravity. It happened gradually and then completely, and Claire didn't mark it or comment on it. She just used the help. At 1:43, the patient in Trauma Bay 1, the first one, the one she had calmed with 2 words at midnight, was stable enough to transfer to a monitored room, and Claire went in to see him before the transfer. He was awake. His color was better. He looked at her from the pillow with an expression that had something in it she hadn't seen from a patient in a long time. Not gratitude, not relief, but recognition. The specific recognition of one person who has survived something together with another person, the acknowledgement of shared territory. "Thought you were dead," he said. His voice was rough. "I know. How long?" 2 years. He absorbed that, looked at the ceiling for a moment, looked back at her. "They're still out there." "I know that too." The others, Sawyer, Bridger, Hollis. Sawyer is in Bay 2, stable. Bridger is in surgery. He'll make it. I don't know Hollis. His jaw tightened. Hollis was behind us. He didn't make the transport. He said it flatly, the way soldiers say the things that are not in any way flat. The people who hit us tonight, they knew exactly where we were. Exactly. That kind of information doesn't travel in the open. "No," she agreed, "it doesn't. Someone's feeding it. Agent Thorne is here." He made a sound that was not agreement, not distrust exactly. The sound of someone who has been burned enough times to have developed a default position of professional skepticism that includes federal agents. "How much does she know?" "Enough to find me. Probably not everything else." "Voss," he said. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Claire looked at him steadily. She'd heard the name before. She had more than heard it. It lived in a specific compartment of her memory alongside a specific set of events and a specific day that she had not allowed herself to revisit fully in 2 years, because revisiting it fully would have required her to do something about it, and 2 years ago she had not been in a position to do anything about it. "Don't," he said. "I'm not doing anything." "You're doing the face? The thinking face?" "I don't have a face. Everyone has a face. Yours goes very still. It means you're calculating something and you're not going to tell me what it is." She looked at him for a moment. Then, despite everything, she almost smiled. "Get some rest," she said. "You're being transferred in 20 minutes. Claire." He said her name, her real name, the one on no badge in this hospital, and she paused at the door. "Whatever's about to happen, sleep," she said. "I'll be here." She left the room and was 3 steps into the corridor when she nearly walked into Dr. Callum Rourke, who had clearly been standing just far enough back from the door to be not quite eavesdropping, and who now looked at her with an expression that had given up trying to fit her into any of the boxes he'd built for her. "You called him by name," Rourke said. "In there." "Did I?" "His admission name is a John Doe." "I must have misspoken." Rourke stared at her. He had his arms crossed again, but it wasn't the same gesture it had been at midnight. At midnight, it was posture of authority. Now it was posture of a man holding himself together while he recalibrated. "I looked up your personnel file tonight," he said. She waited. "Nursing certification, 2 years. References from a hospital in Spokane. Work history prior to that is..." He paused. "Sparse. A lot of people have sparse work histories. Not like that. The Spokane Hospital. I called their HR line, automated after hours, but I left a message." He uncrossed his arms. "Claire, or Valkyrie, or whoever you're supposed to be tonight, I need to understand what I've got in my department." "You've got 7 patients who need to stay alive," she said. "That's what you've got." "And you?" She met his eyes. "I'm the nurse on shift," she said. "Everything else you can ask me tomorrow." She moved past him, and he let her go, and she was almost to the nursing station when the lights in the emergency department went out. Not the emergency backup system. Those came on immediately, the dim amber glow of the secondaries casting the corridor in low-contrast shadow. The main lights. All of them. The hospital generator handling critical systems, ventilators, monitors, the OR, kept running, but the lights in the main ER corridor, the ambulance bay, the waiting room, all of it went dark in the same instant with no warning and no preceding flicker. It took Claire exactly 1 second to process that this was not a power failure. Power failures had a sound, a stuttering relay, a brief overload whine, sometimes an alarm from the building management system that preceded the event. This had been silence and then darkness, clean and immediate. the kind of cut that came from a deliberate external action. She was already moving toward the ambulance bay when she heard it, distant, but not distant enough. The sound of a vehicle pulling into the exterior lot without its headlights on, and beneath that, so faint it was almost imagined, the sound of boots on the exterior concrete of the ambulance ramp, not the shuffling boots of paramedics, the specific controlled quiet of people who knew how to walk so they didn't make sound. She stopped in the middle of the darkened corridor. Behind her, Rourke's voice came low and urgent. "Claire, what just happened?" She didn't answer him. She was listening. Agent Thorne appeared from the direction of the nursing station, her hand inside her jacket, her phone in her other hand, the screen turned face down so it didn't cast light. She moved directly to Claire and put her mouth close to Claire's ear. "We've got 2 vehicles in the lot," she whispered. "My people are calling it in, but we're 4 agents in a civilian facility, and I don't know how long for backup? 12 minutes minimum?" 12 minutes was a long time. Claire turned in the darkness and found somehow that she could see the corridor clearly. Not literally, not with her eyes, but with the specific spatial memory of someone who had spent the last 2 years walking this hall in every light and every configuration, who knew where every doorway was, every supply closet, every junction in the layout. She also knew something Thorne didn't. She knew the ambulance bay had a secondary access panel that maintenance used for equipment routing, and she knew it because she had identified it on her 3rd week at this hospital, as a matter of habit so old she didn't consciously register doing it anymore. She knew the exits, all of them. She knew the choke points. She had always known those things. She had just been pretending not to need them. "How many agents do you have at the main entrance?" she said. 2. "Move 1 to the pediatric corridor, east wing. That junction controls access to the monitored rooms upstairs." She was already turning. "The patients in those bays cannot move, so we hold the bays." Thorne caught her arm. "Wait, you're not armed. You're not—" "I'm the only person in this building who knows exactly where every one of those patients is and what they need to stay alive," Claire said. "That's the job right now." She pulled her arm free, and in the amber emergency light of the corridor she had walked for 2 years pretending to be someone she wasn't. Claire Ashton took one breath and then moved toward the sound of boots on the ambulance ramp. The ambulance ramp was 22 feet long and ended in a set of double doors with a push bar and a card reader that had been on the same access cycle for 18 months. Claire knew the cycle. She also knew that the maintenance access panel was 6 feet to the left of the doors, behind a wall-mounted defibrillator case that nobody ever moved. She didn't go to the doors. She went left, pulled the defibrillator case 2 inches off its bracket. It was mounted on a swivel, something the maintenance team had installed for cable access and never documented properly, and pressed herself flat against the wall in the gap behind it. The panel itself gave her a direct sight line to the push-bar doors through a 1/4-inch gap at the hinge. Not ideal. Adequate. The boots stopped outside. There were 3 sets of them. She could tell by the rhythm, by the spacing of the pauses, the way movement stops are distributed when people are stacking on a threshold. 2 at the door, 1 hanging back at a position that covered the approach. Standard entry formation, nothing elaborate, which meant whoever had sent them wasn't expecting significant resistance inside a civilian hospital. That was their first mistake. She didn't have a weapon. She had assessed that fact and set it aside. What she had was position, layout knowledge, and the 18 months of operational instinct that never fully deactivates regardless of how long you spend pretending to be someone ordinary. She had her hands, both steady. She had the specific and functional knowledge of how much force a human body can absorb, at which angles from which directions. And she had the 4 seconds between door breach and visual acquisition of a target, which was 4 seconds more than most people would use well. The push bar depressed. She counted. The first man through held his weapon at a low ready with the index finger discipline of someone who had been trained but who had been working private for long enough that his spacing was slightly wrong. He came through the door too close to his partner, which meant the moment one of them moved unpredictably, the other one's field of fire collapsed. She registered all of this in approximately 1 second. She waited for 2. Then she moved. She didn't shout. She didn't announce herself. She came out of the gap fast and low and went for the near man's weapon arm. Not the weapon, the arm at the elbow, leveraging down and across her body in a motion that used his forward momentum against him and brought him down to the floor in a way that was loud and awkward and wrong enough to pull the second man's attention for the critical half-second she needed to drive her elbow into his solar plexus at an angle that dropped him to one knee. The third man, outside, was raising a radio to his mouth. She hadn't expected a radio. She adjusted. She put the near man's face into the floor, got one hand on the radio before the third man keyed it, and said into the mic, in a flat and perfectly calibrated imitation of the near man's voice. She'd heard exactly 4 words of it when he'd said something to his partner outside the door. Entry, clear. A pause on the other end, then, copy, proceed to secondary objective. She set the radio down. She stripped the near man's sidearm, ejected the magazine, cleared the chamber, and pocketed both separately. She did the same for the second man, who was still on one knee making sounds that suggested his diaphragm was not cooperating. She zip-tied both of them using the medical restraint supplies she'd transferred to her scrub pocket before leaving the nursing station, not because she'd known she would need them exactly, but because she had stopped, 2 years ago, leaving any space without carrying something that could serve multiple purposes. The third man outside was making a decision. She could hear it in the way the boots shifted their weight. He was at the base of the ramp in a position that was good for watching the door, but poor for anything else, and she didn't give him time to improve it. She pushed through the doors fast, came right instead of left because most people default to covering the left when they're uncertain, and covered the gap between them in 3 steps. He was faster than she'd expected. He got the weapon up. She got her forearm across it at a downward angle before he could acquire her properly, and the shot he fired went into the concrete of the ramp, the sound of it enormous in the outside air, and she heard it echo off the hospital's exterior wall and knew that every person inside had just heard it too. No more seconds to spend. She ended the encounter with a speed and efficiency that would have read as disproportionate to anyone watching it out of context, secured his weapon, and was back through the ambulance bay doors before the echo finished dying. Inside, the ER had changed. The single gunshot from outside had done what gunshots always do in enclosed spaces full of civilians. It had collapsed whatever thin membrane of managed tension had been holding people in their professional roles. And what replaced it was the particular human-animal response of people who understand suddenly that the threat is real and present and not something happening somewhere else. Devlin was pressed against the wall near the supply cabinet with his hands up and his face pale. Park had backed into the corner of the secondary bay with a crash cart between himself and the main corridor. 2 of the ambulance paramedics who had still been inside completing documentation were crouched low behind the nursing station. But Patty Osgood was standing at the entrance to the secondary bay with her arms out at her sides, physically blocking the entrance, and she had the expression of someone who has never been trained for this and is terrified and is not moving anyway. 2 men in the corridor, not the ones from the ramp. Different entry point. They had come through the main ER entrance, and one of Thorne's agents was on the floor by the triage desk with his hand pressed to his shoulder and his face angled down in a way that said he was working to stay functional through something painful. The 2 men had their weapons up. They were scanning the corridor in a pattern that was professional but compressed. Too much ground to cover. Too few eyes. And they hadn't yet resolved the variable of where the actual threat in this building was coming from. They had expected a hospital of frightened civilians. They were recalibrating. Claire came through the ambulance bay doors and stopped. One of the men turned immediately. Fast. Faster than she'd anticipated, and for one instant she was simply looking down the barrel of a weapon at a distance of 20 feet with nothing between it and her. "Drop it," he said. She was holding the weapon she'd taken from the third man at the ramp. She looked at the man who was aiming at her. She looked at the weapon she was holding, and she looked at the angle, and she ran the arithmetic of the situation in the half-second available to her and arrived at an answer she didn't love but could work with. She put the weapon down. She raised her hands. "Where are the patients?" he said. He was addressing the room, not just her. His voice was controlled, which was more concerning than if it had been loud. Controlled meant trained, meant someone operating to a plan. "The patients from tonight's transport. I need a location. Give me a location and this ends clean." Nobody answered. Patty Osgood was still standing in front of the secondary bay entrance with her arms out. She hadn't moved. Her face was white. "Ma'am?" He took a step toward her. "Move away from that door." "I can't do that," Patty said, and her voice was only slightly unsteady. Claire used the moment his attention was on Patty to move 3 feet to her left. Not toward him, not away. Laterally changing her position in the room. The second man tracked her immediately with his weapon and she stopped. "Don't," the second man said. "I need to get to my patients," she said. "There are critically ill people in those bays, and if I don't—" "I'll say this one more time." The first man was still looking at Patty. "Move away from the door." "Those are my patients," Patty said. Her voice was steadier now. She was angry, Claire realized. Underneath the fear, Patty Osgood had crossed into the specific anger of a person defending something that matters more than their own safety. "You want them? You're going through me." He raised his weapon. From the monitored room at the end of the corridor came a sound that was simultaneously wrong and completely unexpected. The measured, deliberate cadence of someone walking, and then the man from Trauma Bay 1 appeared in the corridor doorway. He was in a hospital gown. He had 2 IV lines trailing from his left arm that he'd simply pulled from the pump and clamped manually, badly, so that one of them was seeping through the tape at his wrist. He was upright through what was clearly a significant effort of will over physiology, and he had one hand on the doorframe and the other, the right one, the arm that wasn't damaged, held something small and rectangular. A phone. Recording. "Smile," he said. Both men turned. In the moment of recalibration that followed, Claire picked up the weapon she'd put down, came to her feet, and put herself in a position that, combined with the angle of Thorne's remaining agent, who had reappeared from the east corridor with his weapon drawn, made the tactical math for the 2 men in the corridor arrive at a very clear and uncomfortable answer. The second man dropped his weapon first. The first man took 3 more seconds, which was 3 seconds of a room full of people holding their breath. And then he set it down too. Thorne came in from the east corridor. She had her badge out and her weapon raised, and she was already on her radio calling in the situation. And in the amber emergency lighting of the corridor, she looked at Claire, at the weapon in Claire's hands, at the 3 men secured by the ramp entrance, at the entire situation, and said nothing for a moment. Then, "There are 2 more vehicles in the lot." "I know," Claire said. "We need those patients moved. The monitored room is exposed. I need the secondary bay locked and I need working on it. How long? Backup is 6 minutes out." "Then we have 6 minutes." She turned to the man in the doorway, her operator, her patient, the one who had asked for her by name across a distance of 2 years and several layers of classified history, and said, "Get back in that room and get back in that bed." "I was helping." "You have a chest wound and a cardiac arrhythmia, and you pulled your own IV, which means I need to reset your access before you throw a clot." She was already moving toward him. The phone was good. "Now go lie down." He almost smiled. He was the color of old chalk, and his hand on the doorframe was white-knuckled, but he almost smiled, and that was the moment Rourke arrived in the corridor from the direction of the surgical bay. He stopped. He looked at Claire. At the weapon in her hands, at the secured men at the end of the corridor, at the operator in the doorway who was bleeding through his hospital gown at the IV site, at Thorne, at the agent on the floor by the triage desk who was now sitting up and pressing a supply room towel, someone had brought him one, to his shoulder. Rourke looked at all of it. His face moved through several things in sequence and arrived at something that wasn't an expression she had a name for. "Ashton," he said. "The surgical bay," she said. "Is it secure?" Yes, security locked it down. There's a lockdown on the whole surgical floor." He blinked. "What do you need?" She handed him the weapon. He took it without thinking, then looked down at it in his hands with an expression of profound displacement. "Hold that and don't point it at anything," she said. "I need to reset an IV line." She went past him into the monitored room, and he stood in the corridor holding a weapon that belonged to a man currently zip-tied on the floor of his ambulance bay. And somewhere in the distance, the sirens of actual backup were beginning to be audible, thin and approaching through the Montana night. The next 6 minutes were the longest Claire had spent in a building since a different building in a different country on a night that had officially never happened. She reset the IV, reassessed the chest wound. The exertion had stressed the repair. Not catastrophically, but enough that she spent 40 seconds doing things with her stethoscope and her hands that weren't in any civilian nursing manual, and got the operator back on the monitor before the second wave of any threat materialized. It didn't materialize. The two vehicles in the lot held their positions. She found out later, much later from Thorne's debrief, that the remaining elements of whatever contracted team had hit the hospital had received two pieces of information in rapid succession: that the entry team was down, and that the situation inside had been documented on a recording that was no longer inside the building. The operator had sent the phone footage on a compressed upload the moment he'd started recording, to a destination that Claire would learn about 3 days from now, and that made her exhale very slowly when she heard it. He had been ready. Even bleeding through a hospital gown, even on borrowed energy and compromised physiology, he had been ready, because that was what the people she had once worked alongside were. Ready, in ways that cost them, in ways that didn't show until the moment they needed to be. The backup arrived at 1:29. Federal, not local. 4 vehicles and a response team that came through the lot exits simultaneously in a coordinated entry that secured the perimeter in under 90 seconds. The vehicles by the lot moved twice and then stopped moving, surrounded, and the situation resolved itself with the quiet, procedural efficiency of overwhelming force meeting an already broken opposition. Claire stood at the window of the monitored room and watched it happen. Behind her, the operator's monitor beeped steadily. His vitals were not good, but they were not getting worse, and not getting worse was currently winning. "You didn't run," he said. "No." "When the lights went out, you went toward it." She didn't answer. "You always did," he said. "It used to make Bridger crazy. He said you had a death wish. I told him you just had priorities." She turned from the window. "Bridger's in surgery. He'll make it." "You sure?" "I assessed his chest before they took him up. The trauma attending is good." She paused. "He's arrogant and occasionally an idiot, but he's good." The operator looked at her. "The one in the corridor, the one holding the gun like it was going to bite him." "That's the one." He made the same almost smile. Then it faded. "Voss knows this failed," he said. "He'll know within the hour." The name again. She had been not thinking about it since he'd said it in the bay, which was a specific mental discipline she had developed over 2 years of having things she couldn't yet act on. But the room had changed now. The perimeter was held, the immediate threat was addressed, and the name was still sitting there in the space between them. "Tell me what you know," she said. "How much time do you have?" "Until the federal team comes through that door, maybe 10 minutes. He told her. It took 8. She stood at the foot of his bed with her arms at her sides and listened without interrupting, and what she heard was the architecture of something that had been built carefully over a long time by someone with access and patience and the specific willingness to treat human lives as variables in a cost calculation. She heard the shape of the operation she'd been part of, the one that had officially killed her, and the reason it had gone wrong, which was not incompetence or bad luck, but deliberate engineering. Someone had set it up to fail. Not the mission, the people on it. The name at the center of everything was Voss, Deputy Director Warren Voss, and the operator said that name with the flat particular hatred of a man who has had a long time to sit with it. "He's protected," the operator said. "He has insulation. The people around him are loyal or afraid, and the documentation trail has been managed for 2 years. But the testimony from the unit is why we're alive tonight." He looked at her. "We've been building this, quietly, off record. Thorne is part of it. She found us 6 months ago, or we found her. The line got blurry. We have enough." He paused. "We just needed the one piece we didn't have." She looked at him. "You," he said. "You were there, Claire. You were in the room. You heard him give the order directly. Everyone else who heard it directly is on that casualty list. Some of them actually are dead." He said the last sentence without inflection, because inflection would have cost him something he couldn't currently afford. "You're the last witness to the source command. Without you, what we have is strong circumstantial. With you, it's unbreakable." She was quiet for a moment. "I've been hiding in a hospital in Montana," she said. "I know. For 2 years. I know. Filing medication flags that attending physicians override." He looked at her steadily. Is that what you were doing? She thought about the Delacroix patient, the compounded thyroid medication, the 4 minutes she'd spent verifying a formulation while Rourke had stood in the corridor and told her she didn't belong. I was surviving, she said. So were we. He held her gaze. That part's over now. The door opened. Thorne came in with 2 members of the response team behind her, and she looked at Claire with an expression that had moved past the professional assessment phase and into something more straightforward. The scene is secure, she said. We need to debrief. I know. There's a protocol. The witnesses, the testimony. There's a specific sequence we need to… Thorne, Claire looked at her. Give me 30 minutes to finish my shift. Thorne blinked. I'm sorry? I have patients in those bays. The man in Bay 2 needs his dressing reassessed. The patient in surgery has a family notification that hasn't been completed. The agent at the triage desk needs his shoulder properly addressed by someone who isn't him. She paused. 30 minutes. Thorne stared at her. Then, slowly, she nodded. Claire walked out of the monitored room. The corridor was lit now. The external power supply had been restored sometime in the last 15 minutes, and the fluorescent overheads were back on, flickering slightly the way they always did at Vantage Memorial. That intermittent flicker nobody had ever gotten maintenance to fix. The amber emergency glow was gone, and the ordinary, slightly too bright light of the ER was back, and in it, the aftermath of the last 90 minutes was visible. Scuff marks on the floor, overturned supply cart near the triage desk, the specific disorder of a space that had been asked to do things it wasn't designed for. Patty Osgood was at the nursing station. She was restocking a supply tray. She was doing it with the systematic focus of someone who needs her hands occupied to process what they've been through, and she looked up when Claire came to stand beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment. You want to tell me, Patty said eventually, not looking up from the tray, what I've been working with for 2 years? The same person you always were. Patty set down the supplies she was holding. She looked at Claire directly. Her eyes were slightly red at the edges, which was the only visible evidence of the last 90 minutes, and her voice when she spoke was entirely steady. I told him he'd have to go through me. I know. I don't actually know how to fight anyone. You didn't need to. Claire paused. What you did was enough. Patty held her gaze. Then she picked up her supply tray. Bay 2 needs a dressing change, she said. I know. I'm going. She went. The next 30 minutes had a different quality than anything else that night. The federal team was in the building, Thorne was managing the scene documentation, and the physical threat had resolved, and what was left was the ordinary work of a hospital in the aftermath of something extraordinary. The quiet, unglamorous labor of making sure the people who needed care were still getting it, regardless of what had happened around them. She changed the dressing in Bay 2. She completed the family notification for the surgical patient, sitting in the family waiting room with a woman who had been pacing for an hour and a half, and who grabbed Claire's hands when she said the words, "He's in surgery, but the prognosis is good," grabbed them with both of hers and held on, and Claire let her, and sat with her for the 3 minutes it took for the worst of it to pass. She went back to the agent at the triage desk and cleaned and dressed the shoulder wound properly, which required local anesthetic and more sutures than the agent thought, and fewer than he feared, and he sat through it in silence with the stoic discomfort of someone accustomed to being injured and deeply unaccustomed to having a woman in nursing scrubs be the one addressing it. "You're good at this," he said, which was the kind of observation people make when the reality in front of them has stopped matching what they expected. "It's my job," she said. She found Rourke at the end of it. He was in the break room with a cup of coffee that he wasn't drinking, sitting with his elbows on the table and his face in a specific configuration that she associated with physicians who have had a shift, go in a direction they could not have anticipated, and are now reconstructing their understanding of events from the ground up. He looked up when she came in. She poured herself coffee. She sat down across from him, not because she particularly wanted coffee, but because standing felt wrong for what was coming. "The patient in Bay 1, he said. "He's stable." "That's not what I'm asking about." She wrapped her hands around the cup. "I know." "You knew him?" "Yes." "Before tonight?" "Yes." He turned his coffee cup on the table. Once, twice. A man working up to something. The things you did tonight, in the corridor, the ambulance bay, that wasn't nursing training. No, she agreed. Claire. He said her name differently than he had before, not the clipped professional address he'd used for 2 years. Something more careful. Who are you? She looked at him across the table. In the break room with its bad light and its stained coffee maker and its bulletin board with the outdated shift schedule still pinned to it, she looked at the man who had stood in front of a department full of people 6 hours ago and told her nursing might not be where she belonged. He looked tired. He looked uncertain. He looked, for the first time since she'd known him, like a man who was aware of the dimensions of his own ignorance and was not trying to paper over them. I told you earlier, she said. I used to be someone else. The military, the call sign. Yes. And now? She looked at her coffee. Now I've been a nurse in your emergency department for 2 years. She paused. But I think that's probably done. Something moved in his expression, not relief, something more complicated. You were right, he said abruptly, about the Delacroix medication, the interaction flag. You were right, and I made it into something it wasn't. She didn't say anything. I do that, he said, which was the closest she had heard him come to a complete honest statement about himself, and it cost him enough that she didn't push it further. The patient in Bay 4 needs a follow-up imaging order before he's transferred, she said. Left femoral, rule out vascular injury. He blinked at the shift. Then he almost smiled. It was a small, tired, crooked thing. Of course he does. And the agent with the shoulder needs a tetanus update. He couldn't remember his last one. I'll see to it. She stood up. She picked up her coffee. At the door she stopped and turned back because there was something else. Something she owed him not out of personal obligation but out of accuracy, which mattered to her more. You're a good surgeon, she said. Whatever else, you're good at the part that matters. He looked at her. She could see him trying to decide whether that was a consolation or simply a fact. It was a fact. She left him to figure out the difference. Thorne was waiting in the corridor outside the break room, and from the expression on her face, something had changed in the last few minutes. Something beyond the scope of the scene debrief or the witness protocol, something that had come in from outside. What happened? Claire said. It was not a question. Thorne's jaw was set. We've been monitoring Voss's communications through a parallel channel. He's been using a cutout, but in the last 20 minutes the cutout went dark. She paused. Someone told him the operation failed. Someone also told him we have documentation and a witness chain. And his office issued a travel advisory 45 minutes ago under a jurisdictional protocol that effectively creates a 12-hour window before he's running, Claire said. He's trying to. How far? Thorne looked at her steadily. His private aircraft is at a small airfield 40 miles east of here. He filed a flight plan 30 minutes ago. International. If he clears airspace, then the testimony doesn't matter. He'll find a jurisdiction without an extradition treaty and stay there. We have agents moving to the airfield, but the authorization chain to ground the aircraft is complicated, Claire said. Yes. She looked at Thorne. She looked at the corridor around her, the scuff marks, the restored lights, the still open bay doors where her patients were, the nursing station where Patty was finishing her supply inventory with the systematic focus of a person making order from disorder. She looked at all of it. The testimony I have, she said carefully, the direct witness account of the source command, well, how quickly can that be actionable? If you give it to me right now on record, I can have it transmitted to the authorization chain in how long? Thorne hesitated. 40 minutes. 40 minutes. The airfield was 40 miles east. Claire looked at the clock on the corridor wall. It was 2:41 in the morning, and the night shift at Vantage Memorial ran until 7, and somewhere 40 miles to the east, a man who had signed her name to a casualty list and then spent 2 years making sure no one who knew the truth stayed alive was sitting in a car or a terminal or on a tarmac and believing he was going to get away with it. I need, she said, and stopped. Thorne looked at her. I need a vehicle, Claire said, and I need someone to cover my patients. Claire, he cannot get on that plane. We have agents. You said the authorization chain is complicated. You said 40 minutes. I'm saying that's 40 minutes you may not have. She looked at Thorne directly. I know what I heard, and I know what I saw, and I know exactly who was in that room and what was said, and I have carried that for 2 years, and it ends tonight. She paused. Give me a vehicle. Thorne stared at her for a long moment. From down the corridor, Devlin's voice. Claire! Bay 3 monitor is alarming. She turned. She was already moving. She called back. What's the reading? Heart rate's down to 42. She was at the bay in 12 seconds, the testimony and the airfield and Voss and all of it compressed into the back of her mind where it would stay, contained and cold and waiting, while she was here and a patient needed her to be here. She assessed. She called for atropine. She watched the monitor and adjusted and talked the patient through it, with a calm she had to consciously construct because the rest of her was somewhere 40 miles to the east, running the math on a flight plan and a 40-minute window, and what it would mean if the window closed. The heart rate came back to 58, then 63. The rhythm stabilized. She exhaled. Behind her, at the bay entrance, she heard Thorne's voice, low. I've got a vehicle, Thorne said, and the testimony can be recorded in transit. Claire turned. But I'm coming with you, Thorne said. Non-negotiable. Fine. And you're not armed. I've managed that before tonight. Thorne looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal. The expression of someone who has spent a long time looking for a specific piece of something larger and has just found it and is now recalculating everything downstream of that discovery. Patty, Claire said, raising her voice. Patty came to the bay entrance. You have the floor, Claire said. Rourke's covering. Bay 3 is stable, watch the rhythm. Bay 2 is dressing only. Bay 1. She stopped for a half second. Bay 1 is monitored, and the patient is not to get out of bed again under any circumstances. Understood. Patty looked at her. Where are you going? Claire reached up and pulled the worn elastic from her hair. She'd been using the same one for 3 weeks. She put it in her pocket. To finish something, she said. She walked out with Thorne, and the doors of Vantage Memorial swung shut behind her, and the fluorescent lights of the emergency department continued their steady, flickering hum in the corridor, where, 3 hours ago, a man had told her she didn't belong, and where, in the monitored room at the end of the hall, her patient's heart kept its slow and stubborn rhythm, one beat at a time, as if it too was waiting to see how this ended. The vehicle Thorne had requisitioned was a dark SUV with federal plates and a cracked passenger side mirror that caught the highway lights in a way that briefly fractured the road behind them into pieces. Claire sat in the passenger seat with a recorder in her hand. Thorne's, a compact digital unit that had been in her jacket pocket. And she talked. She talked for 19 minutes. She didn't frame it or contextualize it or construct it for an audience. She just said what she had seen, in the order she had seen it, on a specific date in a specific location that she named clearly and without hesitation, using designations and coordinates and the names of the people present that she had carried in an unexamined compartment of her memory for 2 years. She said the name of the man who had given the order. She said exactly what the order was. She said who else was in the room when it was given, and she listed the names of the people on that mission who had been alive when the order was given and who were on the official casualty report 3 days later. And she did not make any editorial comment about the distance between those two facts, because the distance spoke for itself. When she stopped, the recorder kept running for a moment before Thorne reached over and stopped it. The road was dark outside the windows. Montana at 3 in the morning was a specific kind of dark, wide and flat and indifferent. The kind of landscape that doesn't offer cover, that makes every set of headlights visible for miles in every direction. That's enough, Thorne said quietly. Not to end the conversation, just acknowledging the weight of what had been said in the car. Is it transmittable? I'm sending it now. Thorne had her phone out, the recording uploading to a secure channel. There's a judge who has been waiting on this specific piece. The authorization to ground the aircraft, it was contingent on a direct witness account. What you just gave me, will it hold? It's going to hold. Thorne said it plainly, without the hedging of someone who wasn't sure. 2 years ago, I couldn't have promised that. The insulation around Voss was well built, but 6 of your unit have been providing testimony for 8 months, And the financial trail we reconstructed from the program documents is... She paused. What you just gave me is the keystone. Everything else is circumstantial without the source command. With it, the whole structure becomes a first-degree case. Claire looked out at the road. The speedometer was reading 94. She hadn't said anything about the speed, and Thorne hadn't explained it. How many people knew, she said. At Voss's level? 3, maybe 4. The people below him were compartmentalized. They were given pieces. Thorne was quiet for a moment. The contracting firm that hit the hospital tonight, they were hired through 4 layers of cutout. It took us 8 months to reconstruct the chain. And the ones who did the original mission falsification, the casualty reports, 2 are already in custody. A 3rd made a deal in exchange for documentation access. That's how we got the financial trail. Thorne glanced at her. The system moved slowly. I know that's not adequate, but systems always move slowly, Claire said. That's not a criticism, it's just what they do. Thorne didn't answer. She was on her phone again, her attention split between the road and the incoming confirmation she was waiting for. The SUV was doing 97 now. Claire watched the dark go past and thought about the Delacroix patient and his compounded thyroid medication, and the 4 minutes she'd spent looking it up and Rourke's voice in the corridor telling her she was out of scope. She thought about 2 years of shrinking herself, of deliberately mistiming her responses, of asking questions she already knew the answers to. She thought about the tremor in her hands, which was real, nerve damage, partial, from an event during the operation she was not going to think about in full right now, and about how 2 years of presenting that tremor as the primary fact about herself had worked exactly as well as she'd needed it to, and had also been, in the specific way of covers that are built too well and maintained too long, a kind of slow erosion. She was done eroding. Thorne's phone lit up. She read the screen, and something in her posture changed. Aircraft is grounded, she said. The words landed in the car and stayed there. Federal authorization came through 40 seconds ago. The airfield has been contacted. Voss's pilot cannot file a departure clearance. She set the phone down on the console. He's still on the ground. How many agents at the field? 4 moved in when we left the hospital. More coming from the Helena field office, but distance, she did the math quickly. 30 minutes out, minimum. So right now it's 4 agents and a grounded plane and a man who has spent 20 years building ways out of situations. Yes. Does he know the aircraft is grounded? He will within the next 5 minutes, when the pilot tells him. Claire looked at the road, at the distance they had covered and the distance remaining. At the dark above the flat terrain where the faintest pale edge at the horizon was either the earliest pre-dawn suggestion or her eyes manufacturing hope. Drive faster, she said. But the Garfield Falls Executive Airfield was not much. A single runway, a small terminal building that served general aviation, 2 hangars, and a parking area that doubled as overflow for a farm equipment dealership next door on the 2 weekends a year when the dealership ran a sale. At 3:17 in the morning, the lights over the terminal were on and 4 federal vehicles were positioned at angles that covered the runway access and the terminal entrance, and the small aircraft that had been sitting on the tarmac with its running lights on was now sitting with its running lights off and its engines not running. Thorne killed the SUV's headlights a quarter mile out and came in on the access road at reduced speed, which was standard procedure and also made the specific clicking sound her car made when she eased off the accelerator more audible in the silence. The lead agent at the scene met them at the perimeter. His name was Ferris, and he was a compact man in his 50s with the physical containment of someone who had been doing this work long enough to have stopped performing urgency and simply embodied it. He's in the terminal, Ferris said. Arrived 22 minutes ago with 1 aide and a personal security contractor. When the pilot notified him of the grounding, he went inside. He paused. He hasn't tried to leave. He's thinking, Claire said. Ferris looked at her. He knew who she was. Thorne had clearly briefed the team in advance, but the look he gave her had an assessment quality to it that she recognized as the specific skepticism of a field agent for anyone who has not been in the field alongside him. She didn't address it. Has he made calls? Thorne asked. 2 outgoing, both to numbers in Washington. We're monitoring but not intercepting at this point. The court order for full intercept is pending the same authorization chain that grounded the aircraft, and it's 40 minutes behind, Thorne said, roughly. So for the next 40 minutes, he can make calls. To the extent that calls will help him, yes. Claire looked at the terminal building. Glass front, single story, interior lit well enough that the silhouette of at least one person was visible, moving in the space. She looked at the runway, empty and dark. She looked at the positioning of Ferris's vehicles and the angles they covered, and the one angle they didn't, which was the service road along the south hangar that ran to a secondary gate that a person with airfield access credentials and local knowledge would know existed. "Who has a map of this facility?" she said. Ferris looked at her again. "Why?" "Because the coverage on the south side has a gap." Thorne said, "Show her." Ferris hesitated one beat, then pulled a tablet from the vehicle and brought up the airfield layout. Claire took it and looked for about 4 seconds. She handed it back. "South Hangar Service Road, secondary gate at the east end. If that gate uses the same access credential as the main terminal entry—" "It does," Ferris said, and his expression had shifted enough to indicate he was taking her seriously now. "Standard facility credential. His aide has one. If Voss gives his aide a directive in the next 30 minutes—" Ferris was already on his radio. He repositioned 2 agents to the south hangar perimeter inside of 90 seconds. Thorne watched him move, then looked at Claire. "How did you see that?" "I looked at the map. In 4 seconds. I read fast." Thorne almost said something else. She didn't. They were 17 minutes into the standoff, which was not technically a standoff, which was technically a voluntary presence pending formal federal apprehension, a distinction that Voss's attorney, reached by phone from inside the terminal, had apparently been very specific about, when the door to the terminal opened and Warren Voss walked out. He was 61 years old, and he looked every year of it in the airfield lights. He was a tall man, gray at the temples, built with the kind of maintained fitness that senior officials maintain because it signals discipline rather than because they need it for anything functional. He was wearing a dark coat over a dress shirt with no tie, and he walked out of the terminal with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in an expression of controlled displeasure that Claire recognized as the expression of a man who has spent decades making rooms feel smaller when he entered them. He looked at the federal vehicles. He looked at Ferris. He looked at Thorne. His eyes found Claire Lass, and they stayed there. She was standing slightly back from Thorne, not prominently positioned, not forward in the scene. She had not arranged herself to be visible. She was simply standing where she was standing, in the scrubs she had worn through the entire night shift, with the portable recorder she had given back to Thorne and the worn elastic she had put in her pocket, and a stillness about her that had a different quality than stillness had on anyone else present. Voss looked at her for a long time. "I was told you were dead," he said. His voice was exactly what she had remembered. Low, measured, the cadence of someone who had never in his adult life needed to raise it to be heard. "I know," she said. "You should have stayed that way." He said it without particular feeling, which was worse than anger would have been. A logistical observation, a statement of preference. "Probably," she said. "It was quieter." Something moved in his face. He looked at Thorne. "Whatever she's told you is on record," Thorne said. "Transmitted approximately 40 minutes ago to a federal judge currently reviewing it, along with 8 months of supporting documentation. Testimony from compromised witnesses with evident grievances, and financial records," Thorne said, "and communications intercepts. And 2 cooperating witnesses who have already entered agreement." She let that settle. "The aircraft is grounded, Director. There is no flight plan that clears from any U.S. airport tonight. Your attorney has been notified." Voss stood in the airfield lights and said nothing for a moment. He was doing what she had watched him do once before, in a different situation, in a room she'd described on the recorder in the car, calculating. Running the available variables, finding the margin. She could see him not find it. It was a specific thing to watch. Not a collapse. He was not the kind of man who collapsed. More like a structure settling, a precise and almost imperceptible acknowledgement of changed weight distribution. He looked at Claire again, and this time the expression on his face had something she had not expected in it. Not contrition, something closer to a professional recognition. "You were the weak link I couldn't locate," he said. "I know that too." 2 years. Montana. He almost sounded impressed, which was grotesque, and she felt it as grotesque, and did not let it show. "We looked." "I know you looked." "Where were you?" "Filing medication flags," she said. "In an emergency department." She paused. "Apparently I was out of scope." Ferris moved forward with the formal language and the paperwork that this kind of moment required, and Voss submitted to it with the specific composure of a man who understood that the next phase of this required a different strategy than the current one, and the strategy he was already building was visible in the way his eyes had gone slightly inward, calculating what his attorney could do, what the documentation chain might leave exposed, where the testimony could be challenged. She watched him recalculate, and she felt something she had not fully felt in 2 years. Not satisfaction. That would come later, or not at all, because the people who had died on that operation were still dead, and no legal outcome changed that. Not relief exactly, something more like the specific sensation of a door closing, the sound a thing makes when it is finally, properly shut. Ferris read the charges. They took 2 minutes to enumerate, and the charges were serious and specific: conspiracy, murder, obstruction, misappropriation of classified programs, unauthorized use of contracted forces against military personnel, and Voss listened with his hands at his sides and his face arranged in the careful neutrality of someone saving everything for the next room. Claire turned away before it was finished. She walked back to the SUV and leaned against the hood and looked at the eastern horizon, where the darkness had genuinely begun to change now, a thin gray seam opening above the flat land that was not yet dawn but was the territory before it. Her hands were in her pockets. They were not shaking. The drive back to Garfield Falls took 40 minutes. Thorne drove again, and this time there was no urgency in the speed and the speedometer stayed at a reasonable number, and neither of them talked for the first 20 minutes, which was not uncomfortable. It was the specific silence of two people who have been through something together and don't need to narrate it back to themselves immediately. Thorne spoke first. "There's going to be a deposition process," she said. "Formal testimony, multiple sessions. The trial timeline for something at this level," she exhaled, "years, potentially." "I understand that." "Your cover identity, the 2 years at Vantage Memorial, the nursing license. There are people who will want to examine how that was constructed. Technically, I obtained a nursing license through a process that involved documentation that wasn't entirely accurate," Claire said. "I'm aware. The agency is prepared to address that as part of the operational context. It's not—" Thorne chose her words carefully. "It won't be the focus." "What will be the focus?" "The testimony, the unit, the program." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "And you? What happens to you after?" Claire looked out at the road. "What are the options?" "Reinstatement is on the table. There are people at a senior level who have been waiting for this case to close before making formal moves. Your service record, the actual one, not the official one, is—" She stopped. Started again. "You're being undersold by a significant margin, is what I'm saying. There would be a role, something with real scope." "What kind of scope?" "Training, program development, the next generation of combat medical personnel. There's a gap in the pipeline that's been identified for 2 years, and nobody's been able to fill it because the people with the right experience are either too senior or too far removed from field reality." She paused. "You're neither." Claire didn't answer immediately. She thought about the monitored room and the operator in the hospital gown with the phone and his almost smile. She thought about Patty Osgood with her arms out in front of the bay door. She thought about Park, the first-year resident, watching her hands. "There are patients I need to go back and check on," she said. Thorne blinked. Then she understood that this was not a deflection. "Right," she said. "Of course. Rourke's probably ordered the wrong imaging sequence on Bay 4. "Probably," Thorne agreed, and something in her voice was not quite what it had been. Slightly warmer, slightly less official, the quality of someone who has recalibrated the distance between herself and the person she's talking to and found it shorter than she'd set it. They were 30 minutes from the hospital when Thorne's phone rang. She answered it on speaker because her eyes were on the road. It was Ferris. His voice was flat and careful in the way field agents get when they are relaying something that requires precision. Voss made a call from the vehicle, Ferris said, before we took his phone. To who? We're working on that, but we captured it on the field monitor. A pause. He said, and this is verbatim, the package is already inside, trigger condition met. Thorne's hands adjusted on the wheel. One small correction. Define package. We don't know. We're attempting to locate the call recipient, but the number routed through 2 international nodes, and we lost it. Another pause. What we know is that the call was made at 3:41. The call recipient may have been in proximity to what? Claire said. Ferris's voice came back with the particular care of someone delivering information to people who will need a moment to process it. We triangulated the number's last active position before the routing chain, before it went dark. He paused. The last known position was inside Garfield Falls, approximately 0.6 of a mile from Vantage Memorial Hospital. The road outside was dark and straight and went on ahead of them without any visible end. Thorne said, When? 14 minutes ago. Claire was already reaching for the radio. Patty Osgood answered the hospital line on the second ring, which meant she was at the nursing station, which meant she was where she should be and functional, and Claire let 1 second of relief pass through her before speaking. Patty, don't react. Listen to me. A pause. I'm listening. Has anyone new come into the department in the last 20 minutes? Anyone who doesn't belong? Maintenance, admin, anyone you didn't recognize from earlier? The pause this time was slightly longer. There's a man, Patty said, and her voice was careful in a way that meant she was managing its volume. Who came in about 15 minutes ago? Said he was from the state health department, doing a compliance check. At 4 a.m. I thought it was strange. Rourke is dealing with him. Which part of the department is he in? He asked to see the monitored rooms. Rourke took him to... She stopped. Patty. Rourke took him to the east corridor, where your patient is. Claire said, Listen to me carefully. I need you to pull the fire alarm in the east corridor, not the main alarm, the secondary panel behind the supply cabinet near the medication room. You know the one. I know it. Pulling it will initiate a protocol that moves all ambulatory patients in that corridor to the central hub. It gives you a reason to enter that monitored room with staff. Devlin and at least 2 other people. Don't go in alone. And Rourke? Get Rourke out of that corridor first. Call him to the nursing station. Tell him there's a medication discrepancy on one of the Bay patients. Anything. Get him out and then pull the alarm. Claire? Patty's voice was steady. It was remarkable how steady it was. What's in that room? My patient, Claire said, and a man who should not be near him. Another pause. Then Patty said, I'm moving. The line didn't go dead. Patty left the phone down on the station counter, and Claire could hear the ambient sounds of the department through the open line, the monitor alarms in the distance, a door. Footsteps that she tracked by their rhythm and identified as Patty's, moving with purpose and no visible urgency in the sound of them, which meant she was walking normally through a space where looking alarmed would be the wrong thing. Thorne had the accelerator down. She hadn't needed to be told. Claire kept the phone to her ear and listened to the sounds of the hospital she had spent 2 years inside, navigating them from 40 miles away in the dark, counting seconds. She heard Rourke's voice briefly, a question, surprised, and then Patty's response, even and redirecting. She heard footsteps receding, a door, then the specific clatter of the supply cabinet being moved, the one behind which the secondary fire panel sat, the one she had told Patty about. The alarm was a distant sound through the phone. 2 tones, alternating. The East Corridor secondary that would not evacuate the building, but would initiate the monitored patient movement protocol and require staff to enter every room in that wing. She heard multiple sets of footsteps. Then she heard something else. A voice, male, not Rourke, not anyone she recognized from the hospital staff. And then the sound of something physical, a collision or a resistance, and then Devlin's voice saying something she couldn't make out, and then nothing for 4 seconds. 4 seconds that stretched in a way that 4 seconds can only stretch when you are 40 miles away and cannot affect what is happening. And then Patty's voice again, clear and sharp, and absolutely not keeping its volume managed anymore. Security to East Corridor, now. And then, underneath all of it, from the direction of the monitored room, a voice she recognized. Her operator, rough and low and absolutely stubbornly alive. Claire let out a breath. Thorne looked at her. What's happening? I don't know yet. The phone was still open. She listened. More footsteps, more voices, overlapping. Then Devlin again, clear this time. I've got him. I've got him. He's not going anywhere. She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Patty? She said into the phone. A rustle as the phone was picked up. We have him, Patty said. Some kind of... There's a syringe. He had a syringe. He didn't get to use it. Her voice was not steady anymore. It was shaking, controlled but shaking, the sound of someone on the other side of something very close. Your patient is fine. He's swearing at everyone, actually, so he's fine. Claire put her hand against the dashboard of the SUV and kept it there. Good, she said. That's good. She paused. Lock that corridor. Don't let anyone in or out until we get there. Already done. Another pause. Claire. Yeah. You need to hurry up and get back to your department. She almost laughed. It came out wrong, too compressed, too much in it. But it was real. 20 minutes, she said. She kept the line open for the rest of the drive. The sun was not up when they pulled into the Vantage Memorial parking lot, but the sky to the east had made its commitment. That gray-pink seam had widened and committed, the darkness above it receding in a way that was not dramatic but was definitive, the way most real things are. Thorne stopped the vehicle and they both got out, and for a moment they stood in the cold of the early Montana morning, and neither of them said anything. Ferris had called during the last 15 minutes with an update. The man from the East Corridor was in federal custody. His identity confirmed as a contracted operative with 2 prior known connections to the same firm that had hit the hospital earlier. The syringe recovered from him contained a compound that the lab would need to formally identify, but that the responding agent's field assessment suggested was consistent with a fast-acting cardiac agent, something that would present, in a patient with a documented arrhythmia, as a natural complication. Something that would never have been questioned. Not in a hospital. Not in a patient who had already been through what he'd been through tonight. Voss had known, when the aircraft was grounded, that he was not leaving, and he had used the one call he had time for not to reach his attorney, but to activate the one remaining piece of the plan that didn't require him to be anywhere. He had reached for the version of winning that was available to him. Not escape, but erasure. If the primary witness was gone, if the unit's most credible living member was eliminated before his testimony could be formalized, he had been 3 steps ahead for 20 years. He had simply run out of steps. The syringe, Claire said. It'll be documented. Added to the charges, Thorne said. Attempted murder of a federal witness. That one's not going to need a complex evidentiary chain. Claire nodded. She looked at the hospital entrance. Through the glass doors, she could see the nursing station, the board, the ambient movement of the night shift continuing its work. She could see Patty at the station, just visible from this angle, doing something on the computer. Just working, like it was any other night. There are things I need to finish in there, Claire said. I know. And then I'll need to come in for the deposition process. We'll be ready when you are. Thorne paused. The reinstatement conversation, that's real. When you're ready for it. Claire looked at her. I spent 2 years as a nurse in an emergency department, she said. I'm not sure reinstatement is the word that applies. Thorne looked at her carefully. What word would you use? Claire considered it. She thought about the Delacroix patient and the 4 minutes and the medication flag and the thing Rourke had said in the corridor. This environment isn't the right fit. And she thought about how wrong he had been and how right he had accidentally been and how those 2 things coexisted without resolving each other. I'll think about it, she said. She pushed through the hospital doors. The fluorescent lights did their familiar flicker. The board had changed since she'd left. 2 new admissions, 1 discharge. And Patty looked up from the station and let out a breath that had clearly been held for some time. Devlin was at the medication cart down the corridor, and he raised his hand in a brief acknowledgement and went back to work. Rourke was standing near the break room entrance. He had his arms crossed, and he looked at her with an expression that had moved well past its former complexity into something much simpler, the expression of a man who has finished being surprised and arrived at a different question. Bay 4 imaging came back, he said. No vascular injury. Good. I ordered it the way you said. She looked at him. He said it neutrally, without performance, the way someone reports a fact that is also an admission. Bay 3, she said. Rhythm has been stable for an hour. Park has been watching it. She nodded and moved past him toward the corridor, and he let her go, and then he said her name. Her actual name, not the one on the badge. And she stopped. She turned. The medication flag, he said. The Delacroix patient. He held her gaze. You were right. I want to say that directly. She looked at him for a moment. I know, she said. She went to check on her patients, and the hospital held its breath around her, and somewhere in the east the sky continued its slow and unstoppable decision to become morning. The deposition was 3 days away. The formal charges against Warren Voss were 48 hours from being filed in a federal court. The members of her unit, her actual unit, the one that had officially died in a place that officially hadn't happened, were in monitored rooms upstairs, alive, recovering, waiting for what came next. And in the secondary bay, where the crash cart had been resupplied and the floor cleaned and the evidence of the worst night in Vantage Memorial's history reduced to scuff marks and a bent supply cart rail, a first-year resident named Doctor, Tobias Park was sitting with a patient whose chart he'd been reviewing for the last hour, and when Claire came in, he looked up and she could see in his face the particular open uncertainty of someone who has realized in the last 8 hours that the frameworks they entered this profession with are going to need serious revision. I didn't know, he said. Nobody did, she said. That was the point. He looked at the chart in his hands, then he looked at her. The chest decompression, on the second patient, the technique you used. Write it down, she said. I'll explain the protocol when I have a minute. He nodded. He took out his phone to take notes, and she watched him do it and thought, yes, this is also the work. This has always been the work. She went to the monitor and checked the readout, and it was fine, and she adjusted nothing, and that was also correct. The night shift had 43 minutes left. She intended to finish it. The 43 minutes passed the way the end of hard shifts always pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular density of time that has been fully used. She checked Bay 3 one more time, reviewed the morning handoff notes that she had started drafting in her head during the drive back, and stood for 2 minutes at the window of the monitored room where her operator was sleeping. Finally, genuinely sleeping, his vitals on the screen beside him running in a range that was not good, but was survivable and moving in the right direction. She didn't go in. She let him sleep. At 7:03, the day shift charge nurse arrived, a woman named Sandra, who had been at Vantage Memorial for 9 years, and who took one look at the secondary bay, at the bent supply cart rail, at the scuff marks on the corridor floor, at the federal agent sitting in a chair near the East Wing entrance, and said, with remarkable composure, "Rough night?" "Bit," Claire said. She gave the handoff. All of it. The clinical part, the patient statuses, the imaging results, the medication schedules. The rest she left for Thorne's team to explain, because explaining it was not her job, and because Sandra was already looking at her with the expression of someone assembling a picture from fragments and arriving somewhere interesting. She went to her locker. She changed out of her scrubs. She stood for a moment in the staff changing room in street clothes she had not worn in 31 hours and looked at herself in the narrow mirror above the sink. She looked tired. She looked like herself. She was not sure those were different things. She went back out into the hospital because there was one more thing. Work was in his office, which was a small room off the main corridor that contained a desk, 2 chairs, a whiteboard with outdated scheduling information, and a framed diploma that he had never straightened, which had always struck her as the most human thing about him. He was sitting at his desk with a cup of coffee and a chart he wasn't reading, and he looked up when she knocked on the open door. "You're still here," he said. "I'm leaving." She came in anyway and stood in front of his desk, not sitting. "There are some things that are going to come out over the next few days. About last night, About what happened, about who some of the patients are. She paused. About me. He set the chart down. I assumed. When it comes out, and it will come out, there will be a public component to the legal proceedings. The hospital's going to get some attention. Media, probably. Inquiry from the board about how a staff member with a non-standard employment history was credentialed here. He looked at her steadily. Is that my problem or yours? It could be both. What's your recommendation? She considered that. It was the first time he had ever asked her for a recommendation on anything that wasn't directly clinical. Get ahead of it, she said. Talk to Holt before he reads it somewhere. Frame the narrative as the hospital responding well to an extraordinary situation, which is accurate. Don't speculate about my background beyond what's formally disclosed. She paused. And fix the fluorescent light in the secondary bay corridor. It's been flickering for 3 weeks, and it's going to be in every news photograph. He stared at her. Then something happened on his face that she had not seen before. A genuine, unguarded thing. Brief. The expression of a man who has just found something funny in a situation that has not been funny and is not pretending otherwise. It lasted about 2 seconds. I'll call maintenance, he said. She turned to go. Claire? She stopped. Turned back. He stood up. It was a deliberate gesture, the kind that means something when a man like Rourke does it. Not a reflex, but a choice. He stood up and he looked at her, and what was on his face now had none of the editorial quality she'd been watching for 2 years. No performance, no management of a room, just a person looking at another person and knowing they had gotten something badly, consequentially wrong. What I said, he said, in the corridor. Before all of this. He stopped, tried again. I looked at what was in front of me and I decided I already understood it. I made it smaller than it was. He held her gaze. That was wrong. Not just wrong in the way of being incorrect. Wrong in the way of, it mattered. The way I spoke to you mattered, and I treated it like it didn't. She let the words land. She didn't deflect them or minimize them or offer him an easier version of what he was saying. Yes, she said. It did matter. He nodded. He had not expected absolution, and she had not offered it, and something in his posture acknowledged that the accounting was fair. You're one of the best medical professionals I have ever worked beside, he said. I don't know exactly what that means given the circumstances, but it's true, and I should have seen it 2 years ago and I didn't. And I'm telling you now because, he paused, because you deserve to hear it said directly. She looked at him for a moment. 2 years of corridors and medication carts and shift handoffs, and 100 small moments in which she had known something he hadn't bothered to ask about and had held it quietly and done the work anyway. Thank you, she said. She meant it, not as a forgiveness and not as a release, just as what it was, 2 words that were the accurate response to something true being said directly. She had spent a long time in environments where accuracy was the highest standard available, and she held to it here. She left his office, and she walked out of Vantage Memorial Hospital through the main entrance, and the morning hit her. It was the kind of Montana morning that arrives like a correction. After a night of flat dark and fluorescent interior and crisis compressed into the space of a building, stepping outside into that cold, clear light with the sky enormous overhead and the mountains in the distance wearing their permanent expression of complete indifference to human events, it was physically jarring. She stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital entrance and breathed for a moment. Thorne was leaning against the federal SUV in the parking lot. I thought you'd left, Claire said. I was going to. Thorne pushed off the vehicle and walked toward her. There's something I need to tell you before the formal briefing. Something that isn't in the official channel yet. Claire waited. The deposition is confirmed for 72 hours from now. Federal court closed session initially, with provisions for public disclosure pending the trial timeline. Thorne crossed her arms. Voss's legal team filed a preliminary motion at 6 this morning, attempting to have the testimony excluded on the basis of the witnesses' your documented status. The casualty listing. They're going to argue I'm legally dead. They already did. The motion was denied in 40 minutes. Something shifted in Thorne's expression. Not triumph. Something quieter and more durable. The judge's written response was 5 words. The witness is clearly alive. Claire exhaled. It was a short, involuntary sound, the kind that comes out of you when something you've been holding stops needing to be held. There's one more thing, Thorne said. The unit, the surviving members, all 6, including the 2 who weren't at the hospital last night. They've all been formally reinstated to active record as of this morning. Their service is officially acknowledged. The casualty listings have been corrected. The corrected casualty listings. The paperwork that said they were dead, filed by people who knew they weren't. The administrative machinery of a cover-up that had been running for 2 years under the signature of Warren Voss. All of it reversed. Not erased. You couldn't erase the 2 years or the ones who actually were gone, or what it had cost the people who had survived it, but corrected. On record. True. Claire didn't say anything for a moment. Your listing was corrected at the same time, Thorne said. Officially. You're alive. On record. I've been alive this whole time. I know. Thorne paused. But now the paperwork knows it too. Yeah. She went to see them before the deposition. Not all of them. Bridger was still in a post-surgical recovery that precluded visitors outside immediate medical staff, and the 2 who hadn't been at the hospital were being coordinated through a different facility pending the formal proceedings. But the ones who were here, in monitored rooms on the second floor of Vantage Memorial, she went to see. Sawyer was awake and had apparently been awake for several hours and had expressed his recovery primarily through a sustained campaign of complaints about the hospital food and the television remote that didn't work, and the fact that nobody had told him until this morning what had happened in the East Corridor last night. He was 40 years old, compact and dark-haired, with a jaw that always looked like it was set for an argument, and eyes that were, when he let them, unreasonably kind. You stopped a hit on Marcus from inside a hospital in Scrubs, he said when she came in. There were other people involved. The red-headed nurse, Patty, yes. She put herself in front of a door. She did. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Huh, he said, which was Sawyer's version of being moved. She sat in the chair beside his bed because standing felt wrong in a room that was this quiet and this morning lit, and she sat there for a while without either of them finding it necessary to fill the silence with anything. 2 years, he said eventually. Yes. Was it? He stopped. I don't know what I'm asking. It was fine, she said. Some of it was more than fine. She thought about Patty and her coffee on the first shift, about Park's face when he'd asked her what to say to the patient in Bay 8, about the Delacroix medication flag, which she had been right about, and which had mattered to a specific patient whether anyone acknowledged it or not. I did work that mattered. You're going to say nursing is a real job. Nursing is a real job. He made a sound. I know that. I'm just... He shifted and winced, which was the only visible evidence of the entry wound in his right side. I kept thinking, when we were building the case, when we were trying to figure out where you were, I kept thinking you were probably somewhere terrible, that it had been terrible this whole time. And then Thorne told me Montana, hospital ER. He shook his head. Of course. Of course what? Of course you found the place where people needed the most help and went there. He said it without sentimentality, just observation. That's the job, even when the job is something else. She didn't answer. She thought he was right, but she didn't say so because saying so would have made it into something larger than it was, and it was already large enough. She went to see Marcus last. He was sitting up. Someone had brought him actual food from outside the hospital. She could see the container on the bedside table, and he had color back in his face, and his IV was properly secured, and his monitor was running in a rhythm that was almost approaching normal. He looked at her when she came in and said nothing for a moment. Hollis, she said. Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. He looked at the window. He knew what we were doing. He knew the risk. He was quiet. It doesn't make it easier. No. Nothing makes it easier. You just carry it. He looked back at her. You know that. She did know that. She had carried her own version of it for 2 years in the particular way of someone who can't put it down and hasn't yet found where it goes. She suspected it didn't go anywhere. She suspected you just built yourself around it until the carrying became part of how you stood. Thorne says you've been offered reinstatement, Marcus said. Something like that. You gonna take it? She looked at him. Are you asking because you want me to say yes? I'm asking because I want to know what you actually want. He held her gaze with the directness of someone who has known her in circumstances that don't leave room for diplomatic imprecision. Not what makes sense, not what the offer is, what you want. She thought about it honestly. She thought about the secondary bay and the crash cart and the feel of a chest under her hands. At the moment, a rhythm came back. She thought about the training proposal Thorne had described in the car, the gap in the pipeline, the next generation, the knowledge that was currently sitting in her hands and her muscle memory and her 2 years of doing this work in a building full of people who hadn't understood what they were looking at. I want to teach, she said. It came out more simply than she'd expected. Combat medical, the full integration, not just field trauma, but the transition work, how you function in a civilian context, how you read a clinical situation with a different set of tools. She paused. There are things I know that aren't in any curriculum, that should be. Marcus looked at her for a moment. Then he said, That's the first time in 2 years I've heard you say what you want without adding a qualifier. She hadn't realized that until he said it. The hands, he said. They've stopped. She looked down at them. She knew what he meant. They stopped last night. For good? I don't know, she said honestly. The nerve damage is real. It might come back. She looked at her hands, which were still and unremarkable in her lap. But I spent 2 years letting people believe the tremor was the whole story. It wasn't. It was just the part I let them see. He nodded slowly. The part that kept you small. The part that kept me safe, she said. They're different. Are they? She thought about it. They were. For 2 years they were. She folded her hands together. They're not anymore. The deposition was 3 days later, in a federal courthouse in Helena. In a closed room with a court reporter and a federal judge named the Honorable Patricia Waugh, who had been on the bench for 22 years, and who looked at Claire when she entered the room with the particular attention of someone who has read a file thoroughly and understands that the person in front of them is not adequately represented by it. Claire testified for 4 hours and 19 minutes. She was not asked to simplify anything. She was not managed or redirected or coached into a version of events that would be easier to hear. She said exactly what she had seen and heard and known, in the order she had known it, and she answered every question with the same precision she had brought to every clinical assessment she had made over 2 years in an emergency department in Montana. And when it was done, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the room and felt, not emptiness, which was what she had expected, but a very specific kind of completion, the sensation of a weight not lifted but properly accounted for, documented, on record, no longer carried alone. Judge Waugh looked at her across the table when the session formally closed and said, with the economy of someone who doesn't waste words, "Thank you for your testimony and for your service." She paused 1 beat. Both of them. Claire looked at her. "Thank you for hearing it," she said. Warren Voss was formally charged 6 days after the night at the airfield in a federal proceeding that was not closed. It was public, because the charges required public accountability. That was the specific and important distinction between a classified internal review and what this was. This was a criminal case, with named victims and documented orders, and a chain of command that led to a specific man who had spent 20 years accumulating power inside institutions that trusted him and had used that trust to do things that had no available justification. The charges were read in open court. Murder in the first degree, multiple counts. Conspiracy against military personnel, misappropriation of classified program authority, obstruction of federal investigation, attempted murder of a protected federal witness, that last one added after the airfield, after the syringe, after the man in the East Corridor who had been 3 steps from Marcus's room. Voss sat at the defense table in a suit and said nothing during the arraignment, which was his legal right. And also, Claire thought when she read the account later, the most accurate representation of what he actually was, A man who had moved through institutions without friction for so long that he had mistaken the absence of resistance for the absence of consequence. He was denied bail on the grounds that he represented a documented flight risk, which was the most precise possible use of the phrase. His security clearance was suspended immediately upon arraignment, and the deputy director position he had held for 11 years was vacated within 48 hours of the charges being filed, and his name was removed from the program documentation in a process that was formal and procedural and entirely without ceremony, which was how it should be done. The two cooperating witnesses received reduced charges in exchange for continued cooperation. The contracted operative who had been found in the East Corridor pleaded guilty to attempted murder of a federal witness and was sentenced within 90 days. The speed of that proceeding was deliberate, meant to signal something, and it did. The contracting firm that had supplied the teams for both the initial attack and the hospital operation had its federal contracts terminated and was referred for criminal investigation, and 3 of its senior personnel were charged with conspiracy and weapons violations, and the firm's name appeared in enough court documents over the following year that it effectively ceased to exist as a functioning entity. None of this was clean. None of it was fast enough, or complete enough, or adequate to the actual cost of what had been done. 2 members of the unit were actually dead, had been dead for 2 years, had died on the mission that Voss had engineered to fail, and no legal outcome put them back. Their families received formal notifications of the corrected record, official acknowledgement of their service, and direct apology from military leadership that was delivered in person and without cameras. Claire was told about those meetings secondhand, and she thought about those families and what 2 years of a wrong story had cost them, and she held that thought with the particular discipline of someone who knows some things cannot be fixed and refuses to look away from them on that account. The corrected record was the most important thing. That was what Marcus had said in one of the early depositions when a prosecutor had asked him what outcome he was seeking. He had said, "I want the record corrected. I want the names right. I want the documentation to say what actually happened, and I want the people responsible for making it say something else to answer for that in a room where the answer is public." He got that. All of them did. 6 weeks after the night at Vantage Memorial, Claire drove back to Garfield Falls. Not for a shift. Not because she was required to. She went because there were people she wanted to see before the next phase of her life began, and because leaving without doing that would have been a particular kind of wrong that she wasn't willing to commit. She went to see Patty first. They met at a diner 2 blocks from the hospital, the kind of place with coffee that arrived before you asked for it, and booths that had been reupholstered twice since their original installation. And Patty was already there when Claire arrived, already had her coffee, already had the expression of someone who has rehearsed several things she wants to say, and is deciding in the moment which ones are worth saying out loud. "The news coverage," Patty said. "I know. Your name was in it. I know. And a photograph. Well, I don't know where they got it, some old military record. And Rourke called me the morning it ran and said, and I'm quoting him, she was right about the medication flag." Patty paused. He said it like he was reporting a fact. He was. I know he was. Patty wrapped her hands around her coffee cup. "I'm saying it was the most Rourke thing I have ever heard a person say." Claire looked at her. "How's the department?" "Functional. Sandra has been running nights. They hired 2 new nurses, which they should have done a year ago." She paused. "There's a gap in the rotation that nobody's saying out loud is specifically you, but it's specifically you." "It'll fill," Claire said. Patty looked at her directly. There was something she was holding, and Claire could see her deciding whether to put it down on the table between them or keep it. "You scared me," Patty said finally. "That night. Not the way I expected to be scared. Not the men with the guns. The part before that. When you walked toward the ramp," she paused. "I thought you weren't coming back." Claire held her gaze. "I came back." "I know." Patty picked up her coffee, set it down. I wanted you to know that I noticed. Both things. That you went and that you came back." She looked at the table. "That matters to me. I don't entirely know why, but it does." "Because you put yourself in front of a door for my patients," Claire said. "And people you do that for matter to you. That's not complicated." Patty was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where are you going?" Camp Dunmore, training facility in Virginia. They're building a new combat medical curriculum, integrating field trauma with extended care protocols, transition medicine, the gap between deployment and civilian context. She paused. I'm going to help design it. Patty absorbed this. That sounds like a better use of what you are. It sounds like a different use, Claire said. What I was here, that was also real. I know it was. Patty looked at her. Those patients you treated the night of Marcus, the others, Rourke told me afterward that 3 of them, by his assessment, would not have made it through the first hour without you. She said it plainly. Not probably. His word was definitively. Claire didn't say anything. I'm telling you because I think you should hear it, Patty said. I think you spent 2 years not hearing things you should have heard. I don't want to send you out of here without fixing that, at least a little. Claire looked at her across the table in the diner with the refilled coffee and the twice reupholstered booths and the morning light coming through the window at the angle that Montana morning light always comes, wide and without apology. Thank you, she said, and meant it the way she had meant it to Rourke, accurately, fully, without reduction. She went to the hospital after. Not inside. She stood in the parking lot for a while, looking at the building. It was a Tuesday, mid-morning, and the ordinary rhythm of a regional hospital in a mid-sized Montana city was visible through the glass front. People arriving, people leaving, a nurse crossing the lobby with a chart under her arm, an elderly man being helped through the entrance by a woman who might have been his daughter. The fluorescent light in the secondary bay corridor was visible from outside, and it was not flickering. They had fixed it. She stood there long enough to register all of it, and then she went back to her car. Camp Dunmore in November was cold in a way that had a different character than Montana cold. Less wide, more immediate. The cold of a facility built for function rather than landscape. Claire arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 bags and a portfolio of curriculum materials she had been developing for 3 weeks, and the program coordinator who met her at the entrance was a serious young woman named Lieutenant Okafor, who had been briefed on Claire's background and who responded to that briefing primarily by asking Claire, within the first 5 minutes, 3 very specific and technically sophisticated questions about field triage sequencing in multi-casualty environments. Claire answered all 3. Okafor took notes. You're going to be good at this, Okafor said. We'll see, Claire said. The first training session was the following Monday. 16 students, combat medics in various stages of their training, ranging from new certifications to personnel with 2 deployments, who were being upskilled for extended roles. They filed into the training room and sat down and looked at her, and she stood at the front of the room and looked back at them. She had prepared materials. She had a curriculum outline and case studies and 3 simulation exercises that were specifically designed to expose the gap between what people knew how to do and what they would actually do in the moment when the conditions stopped being textbook. She had spent 3 weeks building this, and she believed in all of it, and she was also aware, standing in that room, that none of it was the main thing. The main thing was standing in front of 16 people who were going to go into situations that would demand everything they had, and being honest with them about what that actually meant. Not the version that fit inside a training manual, the version that happened in real rooms to real people who were imperfect and afraid and limited by their training in ways they couldn't see until the moment the limitation cost something. She knew what that version looked like. She had lived it in a building in Montana for 2 years. She had lived it before that, in places that were harder and higher stakes, and that she would be describing to these students over the coming weeks in the specific and useful detail of someone who had been there. My name is Claire Ashton, she said. Some of you have been briefed on my background. Some of you haven't. What I want to tell you is this. There's a gap between what you know and what you'll do, and it is larger than you think, and my job is to close it. She looked at them. Not by making you into different people, by showing you what you're actually capable of, which is more than your current framework accounts for. She paused. You're going to be asked to save people in conditions that are not designed for saving anyone. You're going to work with equipment that isn't right, in spaces that aren't right, with information that's incomplete and time that's always short. You're going to make decisions with consequences you can't fully predict, and then you're going to live with those decisions, and then you're going to go back and do it again. She let that sit for a moment. That's the job. Not the version in the manual, the real one. A student in the second row, young, close-cropped hair, the careful attentiveness of someone who takes things seriously, said, "How do you handle it? When you make the wrong call?" It was a real question. She recognized it as one because it had the texture of something the person actually needed answered, not something they were asking to demonstrate engagement. "You don't handle it," she said. "You account for it. You understand what went wrong and why, and you carry it, and you make the next call with everything that cost you added in." She held his gaze. The mistake of thinking you can make perfect decisions is more dangerous than the mistakes themselves. You're not aiming for perfect. You're aiming for better than what you had last time. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when something true has been said without decoration. She moved to the board and began. She called Marcus from the parking lot of the facility that evening, sitting in her car with the heat running. He answered on the second ring. "First day," he said. "First day." "How was it?" She thought about the 16 faces, about the question from the second row, about the specific feeling of standing in a room full of people who needed something she actually had. "Good," she said. "Hard in the right way. That's the best kind of hard." "How's the PT?" "Brutal. My shoulder is doing something it shouldn't." The physio keeps using the word impressive in a tone that means alarming. He paused. "I'll be cleared in 8 weeks." "For what?" "That's what I'm trying to find out." She could hear him shift. "Thorne called yesterday. There's a program, joint operation, medical intelligence integration. They want people who can do both, field assessment and clinical analysis." He paused. "Thought you might know something about doing both." "Might," she said. "They asked about you." "Tell them I'm busy." He laughed. It was a real laugh, slightly rough at the edges, the laugh of a man who has recently had chest surgery and is not quite cleared for full respiratory effort, but is doing it anyway. She recognized it as the most alive sound she had heard in a long time. "Claire," he said when he'd stopped. "Yeah. The thing Hollis used to say. About you." He paused. "He said you were the kind of person who made the room safer just by being in it, not because of what you could do, because of how you did it." Another pause. "He was right. I want you to know that." She sat in the car with the heat running and the November dark outside and the lights of the facility visible through the windshield, and she let that land fully, without deflection. "Thank you," she said. She meant for telling me. She meant for the 2 years you spent building something when everything said it was impossible. She meant for asking for me by name in a hospital in Montana when you could have asked for anyone. She meant all of it, and she said 2 words because 2 words were enough. She drove back to her quarters, and she was not thinking about who she had been before or what it had cost or what came next. She was thinking about the student in the second row and his real question, and the curriculum session for Thursday, which was going to push hard on multi-patient triage, and the materials she wanted to revise before morning. She was thinking about the work. The actual work. The work that was hers. Not the cover, and not the mission, and not the 2 years of careful diminishment, but the thing she had always been, underneath and through all of it. The person in the room who knew what to do and did it, who saw what others missed and addressed it, who held the line without needing anyone to know she was holding it. Until they did. Until the night everything broke open and the woman no one had bothered to look at correctly turned out to be exactly who she had always been. Her hands were still as she turned off the light. They had been still for 6 weeks. She didn't know if it would last, and she had stopped treating that as the central question. The tremor had never been the story. The people who had looked at it and decided they understood her had been looking at the wrong thing entirely. And that said more about the limits of their attention than anything about who she was. There were people like that everywhere. People who see the surface and call it the depth, who hear the quietest voice in the room and assume it has the least to say. People who manage to look directly at someone extraordinary and see only what they expect to see. She had spent 2 years letting that work in her favor. She had survived because of it. She had also spent 2 years knowing, in the part of herself she never showed in the corridors of that hospital, that the day would come when surviving wasn't enough. When the size she had made herself would need to break open. when someone would need her to be exactly what she was, completely, without apology or reduction. That night had come. She had not flinched from it. She fell asleep in a room in Virginia, 6 weeks past the longest shift of her life, and the last thing she thought before she went under was not of Voss or the airfield or the charges or the testimony. It was Patty Osgood, standing in a doorway with her arms out, blocking the entrance to a room full of people she had never been trained to protect, doing it anyway, doing it because it was what the moment required, and she was the person in the moment. That was the thing people always got wrong about strength. They thought it looked like the thing in the movies. The dramatic declaration, the impossible action, the moment of obvious heroism. They didn't understand that it looked like Patty with her arms out, not moving. It looked like a first-year resident writing down a technique he'd never seen in a textbook. It looked like a woman in nursing scrubs walking toward a ramp in the dark without a weapon, because her patients were on the other side of the building and she was the only person who knew exactly where they were. It didn't announce itself. It didn't perform. It just stood there. And it held. And sometimes, not always, not cleanly, not without cost, that was enough to change everything.